Mercantilism was an economic system that dominated Europe from the 16th to the 18th century. It was based on the belief that a country's wealth and power depended on its ability to accumulate precious metals like gold and silver. This system operated on the idea that there was a fixed amount of wealth in the world, meaning that one nation could only become richer if another became poorer. Because of this, countries competed aggressively for resources and trade dominance. Governments played a central role in mercantilist policies by regulating the economy to maximize national wealth. They imposed high tariffs on imported goods, meaning that foreign products became more expensive, encouraging people to buy domestically made goods instead. This policy was meant to keep money circulating within the country, rather than flowing to rival nations. In addition to tariffs, governments placed strict restrictions on imports, allowing only essential goods to be brought in from foreign nations while promoting the export of domestically produced goods. Exporting more than importing was seen as a way to bring in more gold and silver, which was considered the ultimate sign of national strength. One of the key features of mercantilism was colonization. European powers such as Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal established colonies around the world to gain control of valuable resources and raw materials. These colonies were not allowed to trade freely with other countries. Instead, they were forced to send raw materials such as cotton, sugar, and tobacco back to their mother countries. In return, they had to buy manufactured goods from their colonizers. This system ensured that wealth stayed within the empire and strengthened the economic position of the ruling nation. Colonies played a crucial role in supplying raw materials needed for industries in Europe, while also providing new markets for finished goods. The economic benefits of colonization further motivated European powers to expand their territories, leading to conflicts over land and resources. Mercantilism also led to intense trade rivalries between European nations. Countries competed for control of trade routes, colonies, and valuable resources, often leading to wars. European nations frequently fought over territories in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, as these regions were rich in resources that could be exploited for economic gain. Trade wars and military conflicts became common as countries sought to weaken their rivals and expand their own economic influence. One major example of this was the series of Anglo-Dutch wars in the 17th century, where England and the Netherlands fought for control over global trade and naval dominance. The desire to control lucrative trade markets played a significant role in shaping international relations during this period. A significant example of mercantilist policies in action was the British Navigation Acts, which were a series of laws passed by England in the 17th century. These laws were designed to ensure that trade remained under British control and that wealth flowed back to England rather than to rival nations. Under these laws, the American colonies were only allowed to trade with Britain and had to use British ships for transporting goods. This meant that even if the colonies could get better prices by trading with other countries, they were legally forbidden from doing so. The Navigation Acts heavily restricted the economic freedom of the American colonies, making them dependent on British goods and services. While these policies helped Britain accumulate wealth, they created growing resentment among the colonists, who felt exploited and restricted by British economic control. Over time, the frustration caused by mercantilist policies contributed to rising tensions between Britain and its American colonies. The colonies believed that they were being unfairly taxed and that their economic potential was being limited for the benefit of the British Crown. These grievances played a major role in the build-up to the American Revolution. The restrictions on trade, combined with heavy taxation and limited economic independence, fueled anger and resistance among the colonists. The famous slogan, "No taxation without representation," reflected the frustration of the American people, who felt that they were being forced to support Britain's economy without having any say in the policies that affected them. Eventually, this resentment turned into open rebellion, leading to the American Revolution in 1775. The war resulted in the colonies gaining independence and the formation of the United States. After gaining independence, the new nation moved away from strict mercantilist policies and embraced a more open system of trade, marking the decline of mercantilism as the dominant economic model. Mercantilism ultimately shaped the global economy in many ways. It led to the expansion of European empires, the development of global trade networks, and the establishment of colonial economies that would continue to influence world history for centuries. However, it also created tensions and conflicts that fueled wars and revolutions. Over time, economists and policymakers began to challenge mercantilist ideas, arguing that free trade and open markets were more beneficial for long-term economic growth. The decline of mercantilism paved the way for the rise of classical economics, led by thinkers such as Adam Smith, who argued that wealth was not fixed, and that economic growth could be achieved through free trade and competition rather than strict government control. While mercantilism is no longer the dominant economic system, its legacy can still be seen in modern trade policies, tariffs, and debates over economic protectionism. Classical economics is one of the most important and influential economic theories in history. It was founded by the Scottish economist Adam Smith in the late 18th century, particularly through his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776. This book laid the foundation for modern economic thought and introduced several key ideas that changed the way people understood how economies work. At the core of classical economics is the belief that free markets, where individuals and businesses are allowed to make their own economic choices without too much government interference, lead to the most efficient and productive outcomes. According to Adam Smith, economies function best when people are free to trade, produce, and consume based on their own needs and preferences. This idea became the foundation for capitalism and shaped economic policies in many countries for centuries. One of the most famous concepts introduced by Adam Smith is the idea of the invisible hand. This is the idea that when individuals act in their own self-interest, they unintentionally help create benefits for the entire society. For example, a baker does not bake bread because they want to feed the community, but because they want to earn a profit. However, by doing so, they provide food for others, create jobs, and contribute to economic activity. This means that even without government planning or control, the economy can grow and function efficiently as long as people are free to trade and pursue their own goals. According to Smith, when markets are left to operate on their own, competition ensures that resources are used efficiently, prices remain fair, and innovation continues to drive progress. This idea was revolutionary at the time because many economies were still controlled by governments and monopolies that restricted trade and economic freedom. Another key idea in classical economics is the division of labor, which refers to the specialization of tasks within an economy. Adam Smith argued that when workers specialize in specific tasks rather than trying to do everything themselves, productivity increases dramatically. For example, in a pin factory, one worker cutting metal, another shaping it, and another assembling the final product is much more efficient than one person trying to make an entire pin from start to finish. This principle is one of the reasons why industrial production became so successful and why modern economies rely on specialized labor. The division of labor not only improves efficiency, but also allows businesses to produce goods at a lower cost, making products more affordable for consumers. This idea became especially important during the Industrial Revolution, when factories and mass production began to dominate economic activity. Self-interest and competition are also essential parts of classical economics. According to Adam Smith, self-interest is a natural motivation for people to work hard, be innovative, and seek better opportunities. When individuals and businesses pursue their own success, they create value for others as well. For example, a company that invents a better way to produce cars will not only increase its own profits, but will also provide consumers with cheaper and better quality vehicles. Competition plays a crucial role in this system by ensuring that no single business or individual can dominate the market unfairly. When multiple companies compete to offer the best products at the lowest prices, consumers benefit from more choices, better quality, and fair prices. Smith believed that competition drives innovation and ensures that businesses constantly improve their products and services to stay ahead. One of the best examples of how classical economics influenced the real world is the Industrial Revolution, which took place between the late 18th and 19th centuries. This was a period of massive economic growth and technological advancement, during which industries such as textiles, steel, and manufacturing expanded rapidly. The ideas of free markets, competition, and the division of labor played a major role in this transformation. Factories adopted new production methods that allowed them to produce goods faster and cheaper, leading to an increase in trade, employment, and overall economic prosperity. Entrepreneurs and business owners were able to start and grow their businesses without excessive government restrictions, which encouraged more people to invest in new ideas and industries. The Industrial Revolution also led to significant improvements in transportation, such as the development of railroads and steamships, which made it easier and cheaper to move goods across long distances. This increased trade between countries and helped create a more interconnected global economy. However, while classical economics contributed to rapid economic expansion, it also had some downsides. The focus on free markets and minimal government intervention meant that some industries and workers were left vulnerable to exploitation. During the Industrial Revolution, many factory workers faced poor working conditions, low wages, and long hours because businesses prioritized profit over employee welfare. Child labor was also widespread, as families relied on every member to earn an income. Since classical economics suggested that markets should regulate themselves, there were no strong labor laws or protections for workers at the time. This led to growing concerns about inequality and the need for some government intervention to protect workers' rights. Despite these challenges, classical economics remains one of the most influential economic theories in history. Many of its ideas are still relevant today and continue to shape economic policies around the world. The emphasis on free markets, competition, and individual choice has played a key role in the development of modern capitalism and globalization. Over time, economists have built upon Smith's ideas, leading to new theories and models that address the complexities of the global economy. While some economists argue that free markets alone cannot solve all economic problems, the principles of classical economics remain a foundation for understanding how economies function and how wealth is created. The Malthusian Theory is one of the most influential ideas in the history of economics. It was introduced by Thomas Malthus, a British economist, in the late 18th century. Malthus first presented his theory in his famous book, An Essay on the Principle of Population, which was published in 1798. The central idea of the Malthusian theory is that population growth tends to increase faster than the supply of food and resources, leading to widespread poverty, hunger, and suffering. Malthus believed that while population growth happens at a geometric rate, meaning it doubles over regular periods of time, the supply of food and other resources only grows at an arithmetic rate, meaning it increases gradually in smaller amounts. For example, if a village had 100 people in one year, 200 the next year, and 400 the year after, its population would be growing geometrically. However, if the village's food supply could only produce 100 units of food in one year, 110 in the next year, and 120 in the year after, the food supply would be growing arithmetically. This gap between population growth and food supply would eventually lead to shortages, making it impossible to feed everyone. Malthus argued that if population growth was left unchecked, it would eventually outstrip the food supply, leading to widespread famine, disease, and death. He believed that population growth needed to be controlled to avoid these disastrous outcomes. Malthus suggested two ways to limit population growth. The first method was what he called preventive checks, which included measures like delaying marriage, practicing abstinence, and promoting smaller families. These actions would help slow down population growth voluntarily. The second method was what he called positive checks, which were natural forces like famine, disease, and war that would reduce the population when it became too large. According to Malthus, if preventive checks were not used, positive checks would inevitably occur to bring the population back down to a sustainable level. During the time when Malthus developed his theory, many parts of Europe were experiencing rapid population growth, while food production methods were still relatively basic. This made his ideas seem realistic and even alarming to many people. The theory had a significant impact on public policies, especially in Britain, where it influenced debates about poverty relief and social welfare programs. Some policymakers believed that providing too much help to the poor would only encourage population growth and make the problem worse. As a result, the Malthusian theory was sometimes used to justify limiting assistance to the poor, based on the idea that poverty and suffering were inevitable consequences of overpopulation. However, the predictions made by the Malthusian theory did not fully come true, especially in the long term. One of the main reasons for this was the rapid advancement of technology, particularly in agriculture. During the 19th and 20th centuries, a series of innovations transformed the way food was produced. New farming techniques, improved seeds, chemical fertilizers, and machinery allowed farmers to produce much more food from the same amount of land. These advancements greatly increased food production and helped prevent the widespread famines that Malthus had predicted. As technology continued to improve, the gap between population growth and food supply became smaller, challenging the core idea of the Malthusian theory. One of the best examples of how technological advancements solved food shortages is the Green Revolution, which took place between the 1940s and the 1970s. The Green Revolution was a period of major agricultural development, especially in developing countries like India, Mexico, and parts of Africa. Scientists developed high-yield crops, particularly wheat and rice, that could produce much larger harvests than traditional varieties. These crops were combined with new irrigation systems, chemical fertilizers, and pesticides, leading to dramatic increases in food production. The Green Revolution helped many countries avoid famine and significantly improved food security for millions of people. For example, in the 1960s, India was facing severe food shortages and was heavily dependent on food imports. However, thanks to the Green Revolution, India became one of the world's largest producers of wheat and rice within just a few decades. Despite the success of technological advancements, some aspects of the Malthusian theory are still debated today. While food production has kept pace with population growth in many parts of the world, other resources like clean water, energy, and land remain under pressure. In some developing countries, rapid population growth still poses serious challenges for food security and environmental sustainability. Additionally, climate change and environmental degradation could make it harder to produce enough food in the future, raising concerns about whether Malthus's predictions could become more relevant again. Some modern economists and environmentalists argue that population growth, combined with unsustainable consumption patterns, could still lead to resource shortages and environmental crises. The Malthusian theory remains an important concept in economics and population studies because it highlights the relationship between population growth and resource availability. It also serves as a reminder of the importance of technological innovation and sustainable development in addressing global challenges. While the dire predictions of mass famine and population collapse have not come true on a global scale, the theory continues to influence debates about population control, poverty reduction, and environmental protection. The legacy of Malthus's ideas can be seen in modern discussions about family planning programs, environmental conservation, and the need for more sustainable agricultural practices. Although many economists today believe that human ingenuity and technological progress can overcome resource shortages, the Malthusian theory serves as a cautionary reminder of the potential risks of unchecked population growth in a world with limited resources. The Ricardian theory of comparative advantage is one of the most important ideas in economics, shaping how countries engage in trade and specialize in different industries. This theory was developed by the British economist David Ricardo in the early 19th century and was first introduced in his book Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, published in 1817. Ricardo's theory challenged the common belief at the time that countries should aim to produce everything they need domestically to avoid relying on foreign nations. Instead, he argued that countries benefit more when they specialize in producing the goods and services they are most efficient at and trade for the things they are less efficient at producing. This idea became the foundation of modern free trade policies and has influenced global trade for over 2 centuries. The main idea behind Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage is that even if one country is better at producing everything compared to another country, both nations can still benefit from trade. The reason for this is opportunity cost, which refers to the value of what is given up when choosing to produce one good over another. A country should specialize in producing the goods that have the lowest opportunity cost, meaning the goods it can produce most efficiently relative to other goods. For example, imagine a country that is excellent at both making cars and growing wheat, but is slightly better at making cars. Instead of splitting its resources between both industries, Ricardo's theory suggests that the country should focus entirely on making cars and trade with another country that specializes in wheat production. This way, both countries can enjoy more of both products than if they try to produce everything on their own. One of the best real-world examples of the Ricardian theory of comparative advantage is the way China and the United States specialize in different industries. China has become the world's largest manufacturer of electronics, producing everything from smartphones and laptops to household appliances and industrial machinery. The United States, on the other hand, specializes in software development, advanced technology, and financial services. According to Ricardo's theory, this division of labor happens because each country has a comparative advantage in different sectors. China has a large labor force, well-established manufacturing infrastructure, and lower production costs, making it highly efficient at mass-producing electronic goods. The United States, however, has a highly skilled workforce, world-class universities, and advanced research and development facilities, making it more efficient at producing software and high-tech innovations. Instead of both countries trying to dominate both industries, they focus on what they do best and trade with each other. As a result, American consumers can buy affordable electronics from China, and Chinese consumers can benefit from high-quality software and digital services developed in the United States. Comparative advantage also helps explain why global trade has expanded so rapidly over the past century. Countries no longer need to produce everything domestically, because they can import goods from other nations that can produce them more efficiently. This has led to the rise of international supply chains, where different parts of a product are made in different countries before being assembled and sold worldwide. A modern smartphone, for example, may have a processor designed in the United States, a screen manufactured in South Korea, and batteries produced in China, all of which are then assembled in factories in Vietnam or India. This kind of specialization allows businesses to lower costs, increase efficiency, and deliver better products to consumers. The theory of comparative advantage is also the reason why many economists support free trade agreements between countries. When nations lower trade barriers such as tariffs, quotas, and import restrictions, businesses can take full advantage of their comparative strengths, leading to greater economic growth and prosperity. Free trade agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement and the European Union's single market have allowed countries to specialize in different industries and trade with each other more efficiently. As a result, consumers have access to a wider variety of goods at lower prices, and businesses can expand their markets beyond their own borders. Despite its many benefits, comparative advantage is not without challenges. One major issue is that not all industries are equally beneficial to a country's long-term economic growth. For example, some developing countries may find that their comparative advantage lies in producing low-cost raw materials or basic agricultural goods rather than high-tech industries. This can make it difficult for them to move up the economic ladder and develop more advanced industries. Additionally, reliance on foreign trade can sometimes make economies vulnerable to global disruptions, such as supply chain breakdowns, trade wars, or economic crises in other countries. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted this issue when many countries faced shortages of essential goods due to supply chain disruptions caused by lockdowns and factory closures in major manufacturing hubs. Another criticism of comparative advantage is that it does not always account for factors like government policies, technological changes, and shifts in consumer demand. Some countries actively invest in industries where they do not initially have a comparative advantage to develop long-term economic growth. For example, South Korea did not have a natural advantage in technology and electronics in the mid-20th century, but through government investment, education, and research, it became one of the world's leading producers of semiconductors, smartphones, and automobiles. This shows that while comparative advantage is a powerful concept, it is not the only factor that determines economic success. Overall, the Ricardian theory of comparative advantage has played a crucial role in shaping global trade and economic policies. It explains why countries specialize in different industries and why trade leads to greater economic efficiency and higher living standards. While the theory has some limitations and does not always apply perfectly in every situation, its basic principle remains one of the most important ideas in economics. The world economy continues to evolve, with new industries emerging and technological advancements changing the nature of comparative advantage. But Ricardo's core idea remains a fundamental part of how modern economies function. Marxist economics is one of the most influential and debated economic theories in history. It was developed by the German philosopher and economist Karl Marx in the 19th century. Marx's ideas were based on the belief that capitalism, the economic system where private individuals own businesses and control production, would eventually lead to deep inequalities and conflicts between different classes in society. He argued that under capitalism, the means of production, such as factories, land, and machinery, were owned by a small group of people called the bourgeoisie or capitalists. These owners made profits by paying workers as little as possible while selling goods at higher prices. The workers, whom he called the proletariat, had no choice but to work for wages to survive, because they did not own any means of production themselves. Marx believed this system was unfair because it allowed capitalists to become richer while workers remained poor and powerless. Marx explained his theory in his most famous book, Das Kapital, which was published in 1867. In this book, he argued that capitalism is built on exploitation. He said that capitalists make profits by paying workers less than the value of the goods they produce. For example, if a worker in a shoe factory makes shoes worth $100 in a day, but is paid only $20, the remaining $80 goes to the capitalist as profit. Marx called this difference surplus value and believed it was the root of worker exploitation. He also said that over time, capitalists would seek to increase their profits by lowering wages, increasing working hours, and replacing workers with machines, which would make the conditions for workers even worse. Another key idea in Marxist economics is the concept of class struggle. Marx believed that history was shaped by conflicts between different social classes. In feudal societies, landowners exploited peasants, and in capitalist societies, factory owners exploited workers. He predicted that as capitalist exploitation increased, workers would eventually become aware of their suffering and unite to overthrow the capitalist system. He believed that this would lead to a revolution in which workers would take control of the means of production and create a new system called socialism. Under socialism, industries and resources would be collectively owned and controlled by the workers or the state, ensuring that wealth was distributed more equally among people. Marx also believed that capitalism had fundamental weaknesses that would lead to its eventual downfall. He argued that as businesses competed with each other, they would need to reduce costs by cutting wages and replacing workers with machines. This would reduce the ability of workers to buy goods, causing economic crises and instability. He also predicted that capitalist economies would go through cycles of booms and busts, with periods of economic growth followed by financial crises that would harm workers the most. According to Marx, these crises would make workers increasingly frustrated and more likely to revolt, leading to the collapse of capitalism and the rise of a socialist society. One of the most significant historical attempts to apply Marxist economic principles was in the Soviet Union. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Soviet Union was established as the world's first socialist state, under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin and later Joseph Stalin. The Soviet government replaced the capitalist market system with a planned economy, where the state controlled all industries, set production targets, and decided what goods and services would be produced. Private businesses were eliminated, and land, factories, and natural resources were taken over by the state. The goal was to eliminate economic inequality and ensure that resources were distributed based on people's needs rather than on their ability to pay. The Soviet economy initially experienced rapid industrialization, especially during the 1930s under Stalin's rule. The government focused on building heavy industries such as steel, coal, and machinery, while also expanding infrastructure, education, and healthcare. However, the planned economy had significant problems. One of the biggest issues was inefficiency. Since production targets were set by the government rather than by market demand, factories often produced too much of some goods and too little of others. For example, there could be an oversupply of tractors, but a shortage of basic household items like shoes or soap. Another problem was the lack of incentives for innovation and productivity. In a capitalist system, businesses compete to create better products at lower costs to attract customers. But in a planned economy, there was little competition, which led to lower quality products and slower technological progress. Over time, the Soviet economy struggled to keep up with capitalist economies like the United States. While capitalist countries benefited from technological advancements and consumer-driven growth, the Soviet Union faced stagnation. The government tried to fix problems by increasing state control, but this led to more inefficiencies and corruption. By the 1980s, the economy was in crisis. Shortages of basic goods were common, productivity was low, and the burden of military spending to compete with the United States in the Cold War drained resources. Reforms introduced by Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in the late 1980s, such as perestroika, which aimed to introduce limited market reforms, came too late to save the economy. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, marking the failure of one of the largest attempts to implement Marxist economics in history. Despite the collapse of the Soviet Union, Marxist ideas continue to influence economic and political debates today. Some economists argue that Marx was correct about capitalism's tendency to create inequality, as seen in the rising wealth gap between the rich and the poor in many countries. Others believe that modern capitalist economies have evolved in ways that Marx did not anticipate, such as the development of social welfare programs that provide healthcare, education, and financial support to workers. Some countries like China and Vietnam have adopted a mix of socialist planning and capitalist market principles, leading to rapid economic growth while maintaining state control over key industries. Marxist economics remains an important framework for understanding issues related to labor rights, wealth distribution, and economic crises. While many of Marx's predictions did not come true exactly as he described, his critique of capitalism continues to shape discussions on economic justice and government policies. Some economists and activists still advocate for policies inspired by Marxist ideas, such as higher taxes on the wealthy, stronger labor protections, and public ownership of essential services like healthcare and education. Whether Marxist economics will play a greater role in the future remains uncertain, but its impact on history and economic thought is undeniable. The Marginal Revolution was one of the biggest turning points in economic thought. It marked a major shift from classical economics, which focused mainly on production, labor, and overall market forces, to neoclassical economics, which emphasized how individuals make choices based on their personal satisfaction or utility. This revolution took place in the late 19th century and introduced the concept of marginal utility, which means the extra benefit a person gets from consuming one more unit of a good or service. Instead of looking only at the total value of goods or labor, economists began to study how individuals decide what to buy and how much they are willing to pay based on how much extra satisfaction each additional unit gives them. This shift in thinking helped explain many economic behaviors that classical economists struggled to understand, such as why water, which is essential for life, is often cheaper than diamonds, which are not necessary for survival. Before the Marginal Revolution, classical economists like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Karl Marx believed that the value of a good was based mainly on the amount of labor required to produce it. This was known as the labor theory of value. However, this theory could not fully explain why some goods with little labor input, like rare paintings or luxury watches, could sell for extremely high prices, while other goods requiring significant labor, like basic food items, remained cheap. The The Marginal Revolution changed this perspective by arguing that value is not determined by production costs alone, but also by how much extra satisfaction or utility a person gains from consuming a good. Three economists are credited with leading the Marginal Revolution independently around the same time. These were William Stanley Jevons from England, Karl Menger from Austria, and Léon Walras from France. Each of them developed theories on how individuals make decisions based on marginal utility, leading to the foundation of modern microeconomics. One of the most important insights from the Marginal Revolution is the law of diminishing marginal utility. This law states that as a person consumes more of a good, the additional satisfaction they get from each extra unit decreases. For example, imagine eating a slice of pizza. The first slice is very enjoyable. The second slice is still good but not as exciting as the first. And by the fourth or fifth slice, the extra enjoyment may become very small or even negative if a person becomes too full. This idea is important because it helps explain why people are willing to pay higher prices for some goods while expecting discounts for larger quantities. Businesses use this concept to price their products effectively, such as offering discounts on bulk purchases or charging higher prices for premium or limited edition items. The concept of marginal utility also plays a major role in determining how businesses set prices based on demand elasticity. Demand elasticity refers to how much the quantity demanded of a good changes when its price changes. If a product has elastic demand, it means that small changes in price can cause large changes in how much consumers buy. If demand is inelastic, price changes have little effect on the quantity demanded. Understanding this helps businesses decide how to price their products to maximize revenue. A great example of this in the real world is how Apple sets prices for iPhones. Apple knows that its customers place a high value on the latest technology, brand image, and exclusive features, which gives the company strong pricing power. Because the demand for iPhones is relatively inelastic, Apple can charge high prices without losing too many customers. At the same time, Apple also introduces different models at various price points to capture consumers with different levels of willingness to pay. For example, they release high-end Pro models for customers who are willing to pay a premium and standard models for price-sensitive customers. The Marginal Revolution also introduced the idea of consumer choice and optimization. According to neoclassical economists, individuals make purchasing decisions by comparing the marginal utility of different goods relative to their prices. A rational consumer will allocate their budget in a way that maximizes their total satisfaction. For example, if a person has $10 to spend on snacks and they enjoy both chocolate bars and potato chips, they will choose the combination that gives them the most overall enjoyment for their money. If one extra chocolate bar gives them more satisfaction than one extra bag of chips, they will buy more chocolate bars. However, if the price of chocolate bars rises significantly, the consumer may decide that the extra satisfaction is no longer worth the higher cost and switch to buying more chips instead. This idea helps explain how people adjust their spending habits when prices change. The Marginal Revolution also influenced how businesses determine pricing strategies beyond just consumer goods. Companies in industries such as airlines, hotels, and streaming services use marginal analysis to set dynamic prices. Airlines, for instance, charge different prices for the same seat on a flight based on when a ticket is purchased. A person who books a ticket months in advance may pay less than someone who buys it at the last minute, because airlines know that last-minute travelers are often willing to pay more. Similarly, hotels adjust their prices based on demand during peak seasons and holidays. Streaming services like Netflix also use marginal analysis by offering different subscription plans with varying levels of benefits, such as HD streaming or multiple users, to capture different segments of customers based on their willingness to pay. Another key contribution of the Marginal Revolution was the development of supply and demand curves, which are fundamental to modern economics. Before the Marginal Revolution, economists understood that prices were determined by supply and demand, but lacked a precise mathematical framework to explain how. The introduction of marginal utility allowed economists to draw detailed demand curves, showing how the quantity demanded changes at different price levels. Similarly, businesses use marginal cost analysis to determine the most profitable level of production. Marginal cost refers to the additional cost of producing one more unit of a good. If producing one more unit adds more to revenue than to cost, the business will increase production. But if the additional cost is higher than the additional revenue, the business will reduce production. The impact of the Marginal Revolution extended beyond just pricing and consumer choice. It laid the foundation for modern economic theories related to market efficiency, competition, and welfare economics. It also helped economists develop better models for predicting economic behavior, which governments and businesses use today to design policies and strategies. The ideas from the Marginal Revolution remain essential in many fields, from marketing and business strategy to public policy and behavioral economics. Even though the core concepts were developed more than a century ago, they continue to shape how economists, businesses, and policymakers understand and respond to changes in markets and consumer behavior. Keynesian economics is one of the most important and widely studied economic theories in modern history. It was developed by the British economist John Maynard Keynes in response to the Great Depression of the 1930s. During this time, economies around the world were suffering from high unemployment, declining business activity, and falling prices. Factories were shutting down, banks were collapsing, and millions of people were left without jobs or income. Traditional economic theories at the time, known as classical economics, believed that markets would naturally correct themselves if left alone. Classical economists argued that if unemployment was high, wages would eventually fall, making it cheaper for businesses to hire workers again. They also believed that if there was low demand for goods, prices would drop, encouraging people to start buying again. However, during the Great Depression, this did not happen. Instead of recovering, the economy remained stuck in a long period of low growth and high unemployment. People were afraid to spend money, businesses were not investing, and banks were not lending. This economic crisis made it clear that the traditional approach was not working, which is why Keynes developed a new way of thinking about how economies function. Keynes argued that the government needed to step in and take action to boost economic activity. He believed that the biggest problem during an economic downturn was a lack of demand, meaning that people were not spending enough money on goods and services. When consumers and businesses stop spending, the entire economy slows down because companies sell less, workers lose jobs, and incomes fall even further, creating a cycle of economic decline. Keynes suggested that governments could break this cycle by increasing spending to stimulate demand. If the government spent money on projects like building roads, schools, and bridges, it would create jobs for workers. These workers, in turn, would have money to spend on goods and services, which would help businesses grow and hire even more workers. This increase in spending would create a ripple effect throughout the economy, leading to higher demand, rising incomes, and ultimately economic recovery. One of the most important ideas in Keynesian economics is the concept of the multiplier effect. This idea explains how an initial increase in government spending can have a much larger impact on the overall economy. For example, if the government spends $1 million on a construction project, that money goes to construction workers, suppliers, and businesses involved in the project. These workers and businesses then spend the money they receive on other goods and services, such as food, clothing, and entertainment. As this money circulates through the economy, it creates even more economic activity, leading to higher overall growth. Keynes believed that during economic downturns, governments should run budget deficits, meaning they should spend more money than they collect in taxes, to stimulate the economy. He argued that once the economy recovered, the government could reduce spending and pay off its debts. Keynesian economics was put into practice on a large scale during the 1930s and 1940s. In the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt implemented Keynesian-inspired policies as part of the New Deal, which included large-scale government programs and public works projects to create jobs and boost demand. While the New Deal helped improve economic conditions, it was World War II that provided the biggest Keynesian stimulus. Governments around the world massively increased spending to support the war effort, leading to full employment and rapid economic growth. After the war, Keynesian economics became the dominant approach to managing economies, and many governments adopted policies that focused on maintaining high levels of employment and economic stability through government intervention. One of the most famous modern examples of Keynesian economics in action was the response to the 2008 financial crisis. The crisis began when the housing market in the United States collapsed, leading to a banking crisis and a severe economic downturn. Stock markets crashed, businesses struggled, and millions of people lost their jobs. Just like during the Great Depression, consumers and businesses stopped spending, leading to a decline in demand and a deep recession. In response, governments around the world implemented massive stimulus packages based on Keynesian principles. In the United States, the government passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009, which included nearly $800 billion in government spending on infrastructure, tax cuts, and direct assistance to individuals and businesses. The goal was to boost demand by putting money into the hands of consumers and businesses, encouraging them to spend and invest again. Other countries, such as China and the European Union, also launched large stimulus programs to support their economies. Keynesian economics remains highly influential today, but it is not without criticism. Some economists argue that too much government spending can lead to high levels of debt, which may become difficult to repay in the future. Others believe that government intervention can create inefficiencies by directing resources to projects that may not be the most productive or necessary. Some critics also argue that Keynesian policies can lead to inflation if too much money is injected into the economy without a corresponding increase in the production of goods and services. Despite these criticisms, Keynesian economics continues to play a major role in shaping government policies, especially during times of economic crisis. Many modern economists believe that a balanced approach, combining elements of Keynesian economics with other economic theories, is the best way to ensure economic stability and long-term growth. Keynesian economics has had a lasting impact on how governments manage economies. It has shaped policies related to unemployment, taxation, and public spending, and has influenced major economic decisions during times of crisis. While debates continue about the best way to apply Keynesian principles, the core idea that government action can help stabilize economies during downturns remains a central part of economic policy discussions worldwide. The Austrian business cycle theory is an economic theory developed by Austrian economists Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. This theory explains why economies go through periods of rapid growth followed by downturns, also known as booms and busts. According to this theory, the main cause of economic cycles is excessive credit expansion, which happens when banks and central banks make borrowing too easy by keeping interest rates too low. When money is cheap to borrow, businesses and individuals take on more debt than they normally would. They use this borrowed money to invest in new projects, expand businesses, buy houses, or spend more than they can afford. This increase in spending and investment creates an economic boom where businesses grow, jobs are created, and profits rise. However, the problem is that much of this growth is based on borrowed money rather than real economic productivity. This means that many investments made during the boom are not sustainable in the long run. The Austrian business cycle theory argues that when central banks lower interest rates artificially, they send the wrong signals to businesses and consumers. Normally, interest rates should reflect the availability of savings in the economy. When people save more, interest rates go down naturally, signaling that there are enough resources available for investment. When savings are low, interest rates should be high, discouraging excessive borrowing. However, when central banks manipulate interest rates by keeping them low artificially, they make it seem like there is more savings in the economy than there actually is. This leads businesses to start projects that require long-term investment, such as building new factories, launching new products, or expanding their operations. These projects might seem profitable when borrowing is cheap, but they become unsustainable once interest rates rise again or when the economy slows down. Eventually, the economic boom reaches a point where it cannot continue. Businesses that borrowed heavily start realizing that their projects are not as profitable as they expected. Some businesses fail to generate enough income to repay their debts. Banks that provided easy credit begin to see rising defaults, which makes them cut back on lending. As borrowing becomes harder, businesses and consumers reduced their spending, leading to layoffs, business closures, and financial losses. This marks the start of the bust phase of the cycle. The Austrian economists argue that this downturn is necessary to correct the mistakes made during the boom. They believe that government intervention, such as bailouts or further lowering of interest rates, only delays the necessary adjustments and makes the economy more unstable in the long run. Instead, they argue that the economy should be allowed to correct itself naturally, even if it means short-term pain. One of the most well-known real-world examples of the Austrian business cycle theory is the 2008 financial crisis. Before the crisis, interest rates in the United States were kept very low for several years. This encouraged banks to lend money aggressively, especially in the housing market. Home buyers, many of whom could not afford high monthly payments, were able to take out loans easily because banks believed that housing prices would always go up. As a result, the housing market boomed and prices kept rising. Construction companies built more houses, investors bought properties expecting high returns, and banks created complex financial products based on risky loans. However, this boom was unsustainable because it was based on cheap credit rather than actual increases in income or productivity. When interest rates eventually rose and the economy started slowing down, many homeowners could no longer afford their mortgage payments. This led to a wave of loan defaults, which caused banks to suffer huge losses. As banks pulled back on lending, businesses struggled to access credit, leading to job losses, declining consumer spending, and a full-blown economic crisis. Governments around the world responded by introducing massive bailout programs and stimulus packages, but Austrian economists argue that these interventions only prolonged the recovery process by preventing inefficient businesses and banks from failing. They believe that if the government had allowed the economy to correct itself naturally, the crisis would have been painful but shorter, leading to a more stable recovery in the long run. A key lesson from the Austrian business cycle theory is that easy credit and artificially low interest rates can create the illusion of economic growth, but they ultimately lead to problems. Austrian economists believe that central banks should not interfere with interest rates and that economies should be allowed to function naturally based on real savings and investments. They argue that recessions are necessary to eliminate bad investments and allow the economy to reset on a more sustainable path. While this perspective is not widely accepted by mainstream economists, it remains an important school of thought in discussions about financial crises, economic stability, and the role of central banks in managing the economy. Monetarism is an economic theory that became popular in the mid-20th century, especially between the 1950s and 1970s. It was developed by the economist Milton Friedman, who argued that controlling the money supply was the most important factor in managing inflation and maintaining economic stability. Before monetarism, the dominant economic theory was Keynesian Economics, which believed that governments should actively intervene in the economy through spending and taxation to stabilize growth and employment. However, Friedman and other monetarists criticized this approach, arguing that too much government intervention often led to unintended consequences, such as high inflation and economic instability. Monetarists believed that inflation, which is the general rise in prices over time, was always caused by an excessive increase in the money supply. In other words, when there is too much money circulating in the economy compared to the number of goods and services available, prices rise because people have more money to spend, while the supply of products remains limited. Friedman famously stated that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, meaning that rising prices are caused by central banks increasing the money supply too quickly. He believed that if central banks carefully controlled the amount of money in circulation, inflation could be kept under control without the need for excessive government intervention in the economy. This idea was in direct opposition to Keynesian economics, which argued that inflation could be managed through government policies such as taxation and spending. Monetarists argued that when governments spend too much money or keep interest rates too low for too long, they create artificial economic booms that eventually lead to inflation and financial crises. Instead of relying on government spending to boost the economy, monetarists believed that central banks should focus on maintaining a steady and predictable growth rate in the money supply. They argued that this approach would create a more stable economy with lower inflation and fewer financial crises. One of the biggest real-world tests of monetarism came in the 1970s and 1980s, when the United States experienced a severe economic problem known as stagflation. Stagflation is a rare situation where the economy suffers from high inflation, slow economic growth, and high unemployment all at the same time. According to traditional Keynesian economics, inflation and unemployment were supposed to have an inverse relationship, meaning that when one was high, the other should be low. However, in the 1970s, both inflation and unemployment were rising together, which created a major challenge for economic policymakers. Many economists at the time struggled to explain this situation using Keynesian theories, which made monetarism an attractive alternative. In response to stagflation, the United States Federal Reserve, under the leadership of its chairman Paul Volcker, implemented monetarist policies in the early 1980s. The Federal Reserve sharply reduced the growth of the money supply and raised interest rates to extremely high levels in an effort to bring inflation under control. This approach was based on Friedman's belief that inflation was caused by too much money in the economy. By reducing the supply of money and making borrowing more expensive, the goal was to slow down inflation and restore economic stability. These policies were extremely painful in the short term because high interest rates made it more expensive for businesses and consumers to borrow money. As a result, the economy fell into a deep recession, and unemployment rose sharply. However, after a few years, inflation was successfully brought under control, and economic growth eventually resumed. This period is often seen as one of the biggest successes of monetarist policy, as it demonstrated that inflation could be controlled by managing the money supply rather than relying on government intervention. Despite its successes, monetarism is not without criticism. Some economists argue that monetarist policies can be too rigid, and that focusing solely on controlling the money supply does not always account for other factors that influence the economy, such as changes in productivity, global trade, and technological advancements. Others argue that central banks cannot perfectly control the money supply because the demand for money changes based on economic conditions. Additionally, some critics believe that monetarist policies can lead to unnecessary economic pain, as seen in the early 1980s when the Federal Reserve's aggressive approach led to a deep recession before the economy recovered. Although monetarism is not as dominant today as it was in the late 20th century, it still plays an important role in modern economic policy. Many central banks around the world, including the US Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of England, continue to use monetarist principles when setting interest rates and managing inflation. The idea that excessive money supply growth leads to inflation remains widely accepted, and many governments and central banks focus on maintaining stable and predictable monetary policies to ensure long-term economic stability. Monetarism has influenced many aspects of modern economics, and while debates continue over the best way to manage inflation and economic growth, its core ideas remain an important part of economic discussions today. Game theory is the study of how people, businesses, and governments make decisions when they are interacting with others who also have their own goals and strategies. It is a mathematical approach to understanding strategic decision-making, which means it helps predict what choices individuals or groups will make in different situations. Game theory is used in many fields, including economics, business, politics, and even military strategy. The basic idea of game theory is that when people or organizations make decisions, they do not act in isolation. Instead, they consider what others might do in response. Every decision has consequences, and the outcome depends not just on one person's choice, but also on how others react. Because of this, game theory helps explain why people and businesses make certain choices, even when those choices do not seem logical at first. One of the most famous examples in game theory is the prisoner's dilemma, which demonstrates how two people or companies might not cooperate, even when it is in their best interest to do so. Imagine that two criminals are arrested and are being held in separate rooms. The police offer each prisoner a deal. If one prisoner confesses and the other stays silent, the one who confesses will go free while the other will get a long prison sentence. If both confess, they will both receive a moderate sentence. If both stay silent, they will each receive a light sentence. The best outcome for both prisoners would be to stay silent, but because they do not trust each other and fear that the other might confess, they both end up confessing, leading to a worse outcome than if they had cooperated. This example shows how people or businesses sometimes act in a way that seems rational for them individually, but leads to a worse result overall. The prisoner's dilemma is not just a theoretical concept, it has real-world applications, especially in business and economics. One of the best examples is price wars between companies such as Coca-Cola and Pepsi. These two companies are direct competitors in the soft drink industry, and each company wants to maximize its profits. If both companies keep their prices high, they can both earn good profits. However, each company has an incentive to lower its prices to attract more customers from the other. If one company lowers its prices while the other keeps them high, the company with lower prices will gain more market share and make more money. But if both companies lower their prices, they will engage in a price war, reducing profits for both. Just like in the prisoner's dilemma, the best outcome for both companies would be to keep prices high, but because they do not fully trust that the other will do the same, they often lower prices, leading to lower profits for both. Game theory is also widely used in other areas of economics and politics. In international relations, governments use game theory to make decisions about diplomacy, trade, and military strategy. For example, during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were engaged in an arms race where both countries kept building more nuclear weapons. If both countries had agreed to stop, they could have saved money and reduced the risk of war. However, each country feared that if they stopped while the other continued, they would be at a military disadvantage. This fear led both countries to keep increasing their weapons, even though it was costly and dangerous. This situation is an example of the concept known as the Nash equilibrium, named after mathematician John Nash, which occurs when all players in a game choose their best strategy based on what they expect others to do, even if it leads to a less than ideal outcome. Game theory is also important in everyday life. It explains how people negotiate, how businesses set prices, how companies decide on advertising strategies, and even how sports teams plan their tactics. In business, companies use game theory to determine how much to invest in research and development, how to respond to competitors' moves, and whether to enter new markets. Governments use game theory to design policies that encourage cooperation and avoid conflicts, such as international trade agreements or climate change negotiations. One of the key lessons of game theory is that decision-making is not just about what one individual or company wants, but also about predicting how others will respond. In some cases, cooperation leads to the best results for everyone involved, while in other cases, competition is unavoidable. By understanding game theory, businesses, governments, and individuals can make smarter decisions that take into account not only their own interests, but also the likely reactions of others. This ability to anticipate and respond to strategic interactions makes game theory a powerful tool for understanding how the world works in areas as diverse as economics, politics, business, and even personal decision-making. Supply-side economics is an economic theory that argues that economic growth is best achieved by making it easier for businesses and individuals to produce goods and services. It suggests that when governments reduce taxes, remove unnecessary regulations, and encourage investment, businesses will expand, create more jobs, and increase overall economic output. The main idea is that by focusing on the supply side of the economy, meaning the production of goods and services, wealth will be created, and this growth will eventually benefit everyone. This theory became especially popular in the late 20th century and was used as the foundation for many government policies aimed at boosting economic growth. Supply-side economists believe that high taxes and strict government regulations can slow down economic progress by making it more expensive and difficult for businesses to operate. When businesses have to pay too much in taxes or follow too many government rules, they may be discouraged from expanding, hiring more workers, or investing in new technology. This can lead to slower economic growth and fewer job opportunities. To solve this problem, supply-side economists argue that cutting taxes and reducing government restrictions will create an environment where businesses are more willing to invest, leading to more economic activity, higher employment rates, and rising incomes. One of the most famous examples of supply-side economics in action is the set of policies known as Reaganomics, named after former US President Ronald Reagan. In the early 1980s, the United States was facing a period of economic stagnation, high unemployment, and inflation. In response, Reagan introduced a series of economic policies based on supply-side principles. His administration implemented significant tax cuts, including reducing the top income tax rate from 70% to 28%. The idea behind these tax cuts was that if businesses and individuals were allowed to keep more of their income, they would invest and spend more, leading to increased economic growth. Reagan also focused on deregulation, meaning he reduced government rules that controlled how businesses operated. The goal was to make it easier for companies to expand, innovate, and create jobs. His administration also worked to reduce government spending on certain programs, while increasing military spending, which was another major aspect of his economic policy. The effects of Reaganomics were widely debated. Supporters of supply-side economics argue that these policies helped revive the American economy. During the Reagan years, the United States saw strong economic growth, with gross domestic product increasing significantly. Inflation, which had been a major problem in the 1970s, also decreased, and millions of new jobs were created. However, critics argue that while economic growth improved, the benefits were not shared equally. One of the biggest criticisms of supply-side economics is that it tends to benefit the wealthy more than the middle class or the poor. Since tax cuts were often aimed at higher-income individuals and businesses, some people believed that supply-side policies increased income inequality. Another major criticism is that these policies contributed to a growing budget deficit. Because the government was collecting less revenue from taxes but still spending large amounts, the national debt increased. Many economists argue that while tax cuts can sometimes encourage growth, they also reduce government funds, which can lead to cuts in important social programs or increased borrowing. Despite these debates, supply-side economics remains an influential theory, and many governments continue to use its principles when designing economic policies. Countries around the world have experimented with tax cuts and deregulation to boost their economies, with varying degrees of success. Some argue that supply-side policies work best when combined with other economic strategies, such as investing in education, infrastructure, and innovation, rather than relying solely on tax cuts and deregulation. In modern times, discussions about supply-side economics continue, especially when governments debate tax policies and regulations. Supporters believe that reducing the burden on businesses and individuals leads to long-term economic growth, while opponents argue that focusing too much on the supply side can lead to greater inequality and government debt. Regardless of the differing opinions, supply-side economics has played a major role in shaping economic policies over the past several decades, and remains a key topic in discussions about how to promote economic growth and stability. Behavioral economics is a field of study that looks at how people actually make financial decisions, instead of assuming that they always act rationally. Traditional economics assumes that people carefully weigh the costs and benefits of every decision, and always choose the option that gives them the most value. However, behavioral economics challenges this idea by showing that people often make financial choices based on emotions, habits, and psychological biases rather than pure logic. This means that people do not always act in their own best financial interest, even when they have all the information they need. Many factors influence how people handle money, such as fear, excitement, overconfidence, and even the way a choice is presented. Behavioral economists study these patterns to understand why people make financial mistakes, how they can be avoided, and how businesses, policymakers, and financial advisors can design better systems to help people make smarter choices with their money. One of the most important concepts in behavioral economics is loss aversion, which refers to the idea that people feel the pain of losing money much more strongly than they feel the joy of gaining money. For example, if someone finds $20 on the street, they might feel happy for a few minutes. But if they lose $20, they are likely to feel upset for much longer. This fear of loss affects financial decision-making in many ways, especially in the stock market. Many investors hesitate to sell stocks that are losing value because they do not want to admit that they made a bad investment. Instead of cutting their losses and reinvesting in something more promising, they hold on to losing stocks in the hope that the price will go back up, even when there is no logical reason to believe it will. This behavior is known as the disposition effect and can lead to poor financial outcomes because it prevents investors from making rational decisions based on actual market conditions. Loss aversion also affects how investors react to market news. When the stock market drops sharply, many investors panic and sell their stocks at a loss, fearing that prices will fall even further. However, this often means they miss out on potential gains when the market eventually recovers. On the other hand, when stock prices are rising, people tend to become overconfident and invest more money, sometimes ignoring warning signs that the market might be overheating. This pattern of buying high and selling low is the opposite of what successful investors should do, but it happens frequently because emotions play a big role in financial decisions. Behavioral economists have found that people are more likely to take financial risks when they are winning, but become extremely cautious when they are losing, even when it would be smarter to do the opposite. Another key idea in behavioral economics is mental accounting, which describes how people treat money differently depending on where it comes from and how they plan to use it. For example, someone who receives a tax refund might spend it freely on luxury items, even if they have debt to pay off. The same person might hesitate to spend money from their regular paycheck in the same way, even though all money should be treated equally from a financial perspective. This type of thinking can lead people to make irrational financial choices, such as spending unexpected bonuses instead of saving them, or being overly cautious with money in one area while being reckless in another. Businesses and marketers understand these psychological biases and often design pricing strategies and promotions that take advantage of them. For example, stores use discount tags that show the original price crossed out with a lower price underneath, making customers feel like they are avoiding a loss by taking advantage of the deal. Similarly, casinos and gambling apps use chips or digital credits instead of real cash, because people are more willing to take risks when they do not feel like they are directly losing money. Behavioral economics has many real-world applications beyond investing and spending habits. Governments and financial institutions use insights from this field to design better policies that encourage people to save more, spend wisely, and avoid common financial mistakes. For example, many companies automatically enroll employees in retirement savings plans instead of requiring them to sign up on their own. Studies have shown that when people have to actively opt in to saving money, they are less likely to do it. But when they are automatically enrolled with the option to opt out, most people stay in the program. This simple change in policy helps millions of workers build long-term savings without requiring them to make an active decision. Understanding behavioral economics can help individuals make smarter financial choices by recognizing the common biases that affect decision-making. By being aware of loss aversion, people can train themselves to make investment decisions based on logic rather than fear. By understanding mental accounting, people can manage their money more effectively and avoid unnecessary spending. Behavioral economics provides valuable insights that challenge traditional economic theories and offer a more realistic view of how people actually handle money. It continues to influence financial education, investment strategies, and public policies designed to improve financial well-being for individuals and society as a whole. New Keynesian Economics is an economic theory that builds on the ideas of John Maynard Keynes, but adds new insights about why markets do not always function perfectly. Traditional Keynesian economics argues that government intervention is necessary to help economies recover from recessions and keep unemployment low. New Keynesian economics agrees with this idea, but focuses more on why prices and wages do not always adjust quickly to changes in the economy. One of the key concepts in this theory is price stickiness, which means that prices do not always change as fast as economic conditions change. For example, if there is a recession and demand for goods and services falls, businesses do not immediately lower their prices to attract more customers. Similarly, if the economy is growing and unemployment is low, companies do not instantly raise wages to attract more workers. These delays in price and wage adjustments can slow down economic recovery and make recessions last longer than they should. New Keynesian economists believe that because prices and wages do not adjust quickly, governments need to take action to boost demand and help the economy recover. One major reason why prices and wages are sticky is that businesses and workers prefer stability. Many companies set their prices based on long-term contracts or agreements, and they do not want to change them frequently because it can confuse customers or make planning more difficult. Workers also resist wage cuts, even during economic downturns, because they have financial commitments like rent, mortgages, and other living expenses. This resistance to lowering wages is known as downward wage rigidity, and it can lead to higher unemployment during recessions because companies prefer to lay off workers instead of reducing wages across the board. New Keynesian economists argue that when the economy slows down, governments should step in with policies that encourage spending and investment. One of the most common ways to do this is through fiscal policy, which includes government spending programs and direct financial aid to households and businesses. Another important tool is monetary policy, where central banks lower interest rates to make borrowing cheaper, encouraging businesses and consumers to spend more. A real-world example of new Keynesian economics in action was the United States government's response to the economic crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. The pandemic led to massive job losses, business closures, and a sharp decline in economic activity as people stayed home and reduced their spending. Because of price stickiness and wage rigidity, the economy did not adjust on its own quickly enough to prevent widespread hardship. To address this crisis, the US government implemented several stimulus programs based on new Keynesian principles. One of the most significant measures was the direct stimulus checks sent to individuals and families to boost spending and prevent a deeper recession. These checks were designed to increase demand by giving people more money to spend on essential goods and services. Since businesses were struggling due to lower demand, the stimulus checks helped keep the economy from collapsing by encouraging people to continue purchasing goods and services. In addition to direct stimulus payments, the government also expanded unemployment benefits and provided financial aid to small businesses. This was important because many businesses faced reduced revenue and risked shutting down, which would have led to even higher unemployment. By providing financial assistance, the government helped businesses stay afloat and keep workers employed. Another key policy was the decision by the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, to lower interest rates and inject more money into the financial system. This made borrowing cheaper, allowing businesses to take out loans to cover expenses and continue operating. These policies were designed to counteract the negative effects of price and wage stickiness, which slowed down economic recovery. The results of these policies were widely debated, but many economists believe that they helped prevent a much deeper and longer-lasting recession. Although unemployment still rose to high levels during the early months of the pandemic, the stimulus measures helped many people maintain their income and prevented further economic collapse. Over time, as the economy began to recover, businesses reopened and job growth increased. However, critics of these policies argue that the large amount of government spending contributed to rising inflation in the years that followed. Inflation occurs when too much money is circulating in the economy, leading to higher prices for goods and services. Some economists believe that while stimulus measures were necessary to prevent a deep recession, they may have also contributed to the inflation problems that emerged in 2021 and 2022. New Keynesian economics remains one of the most influential economic theories in modern policymaking. It provides a framework for understanding why markets do not always adjust quickly to shocks, and why government intervention can be necessary to stabilize the economy. Unlike classical economic theories that assume markets are always efficient, new Keynesian economics recognizes that real-world factors such as contracts, rigid wages, and business decisions based on uncertainty can create inefficiencies that slow down recovery. This theory has shaped many government responses to economic crises over the past several decades, including the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. While debates continue over the long-term effects of these policies, new Keynesian economics remains a key approach for managing economic downturns and promoting stability in modern economies. Rational expectations. Theory is an important economic idea that explains how people make decisions based on their expectations of the future. The theory suggests that individuals and businesses do not just react to what is happening in the economy right now, but also anticipate future changes in policies, inflation, and other economic factors. This means that if people expect something to happen in the future, they will change their behavior today in ways that may influence the outcome of economic policies. The theory was developed by economist John Muth in the 1960s, and later expanded by Robert Lucas, who used it to challenge many traditional economic models. Before this theory, many economists believed that government policies could easily influence economic growth and unemployment. However, rational expectations theory argues that, because people and businesses think ahead, they may adjust their behavior in ways that reduce or even cancel out the intended effects of government policies. This idea has played a major role in shaping modern macroeconomics and has influenced how central banks and governments create economic policies. One of the most important areas where rational expectations theory applies is inflation and monetary policy. Inflation happens when the prices of goods and services rise over time, reducing the purchasing power of money. Central banks, such as the Federal Reserve in the United States or the European Central Bank, use monetary policy tools to control inflation and keep the economy stable. These tools include adjusting interest rates and controlling the supply of money in the economy. However, rational expectations theory suggests that if people expect inflation to increase in the future, they will act in ways that actually make inflation rise even faster. For example, if workers believe that prices will go up next year, they will demand higher wages today to protect their purchasing power. Businesses, expecting higher costs, will raise prices on their products. This cycle can make inflation worse and harder for central banks to control. On the other hand, if people believe that inflation will remain low, they will not push for higher wages, and businesses will not feel the need to raise prices, keeping inflation under control. This is why central banks focus not just on current inflation, but also on managing inflation expectations. A real-world example of rational expectations theory in action can be seen in how central banks communicate their policies to influence long-term inflation expectations. One of the most famous cases is the fight against inflation in the United States during the early 1980s. In the 1970s, the US experienced a period of high inflation, partly because people expected prices to keep rising. To break this cycle, the Federal Reserve, led by Chairman Paul Volcker, took aggressive action by raising interest rates to very high levels. This made borrowing more expensive and slowed down economic activity, leading to a painful recession. However, by making it clear that the central bank was committed to fighting inflation, Volcker helped change people's expectations. Over time, as individuals and businesses believed that inflation would stay low, wage and price increases slowed down, and inflation eventually dropped. This case shows how managing expectations is just as important as changing interest rates or other economic policies. Another way rational expectations theory applies is in government spending and taxation. Traditional Keynesian economics suggests that when the government spends more money, it can boost economic growth by increasing demand. However, rational expectations theory argues that if people believe that increased government spending today will lead to higher taxes in the future, they may choose to save more money instead of spending it. This can reduce the effectiveness of government stimulus programs. A similar idea applies to tax cuts. If people think a tax cut is temporary, they may not increase their spending because they expect taxes to go back up later. This means that government policies may not always have the intended effect if individuals and businesses are looking ahead and adjusting their decisions based on future expectations. Rational expectations theory has had a major impact on economic policy and how governments and central banks approach economic management. It has influenced the development of new economic models that take into account how people react to policy changes. Some critics argue that the theory assumes people are too rational, and that in reality, emotions, misinformation, and unpredictable events can lead to different behaviors. However, even with its limitations, the theory remains an important part of modern economics. It has changed the way economists think about inflation, unemployment, and government policies, and it continues to shape the decisions of policymakers around the world. The efficient market hypothesis is an economic theory that explains how financial markets work and why it is very difficult for investors to consistently earn higher returns than the overall market. The theory was developed by economist Eugene Fama in the 1960s and is based on the idea that stock prices always reflect all available information. This means that as soon as new information about a company or the economy becomes public, it is immediately factored into stock prices. Because of this, no investor can consistently find stocks that are undervalued or overvalued, since prices adjust so quickly. The theory suggests that it is nearly impossible to beat the market in the long run through stock picking or market timing, because all known advantages are already included in the price. As a result, investors who actively try to pick stocks or time the market are unlikely to outperform a simple strategy of investing in a broad market index fund. The efficient market hypothesis is divided into three forms. The weak form states that past stock prices and trading volume do not provide any clues about future prices, meaning technical analysis, which involves studying past price movements to predict future trends, is unlikely to work. The semi-strong form says that all publicly available information, including financial reports, news articles, and economic data, is already reflected in stock prices. This means that even fundamental analysis, which involves studying a company's financial health and business prospects, will not lead to consistent excess returns. The strong form of the hypothesis takes this idea even further by stating that even insider information, which is information not yet available to the public, is already reflected in stock prices. If the strong form were completely true, even corporate executives with privileged knowledge would not be able to make profitable trades. However, in reality, insider trading laws exist because insiders do sometimes have an advantage, which suggests that the strong form is not completely accurate. One of the biggest debates surrounding the efficient market hypothesis is whether it is truly impossible to beat the market. Many legendary investors, such as Warren Buffett, have built fortunes by picking stocks they believe are undervalued. Buffett follows a strategy called value investing, where he looks for companies with strong fundamentals that he believes are priced too low. His success has led some to argue that markets are not always perfectly efficient, and that skilled investors can still find mispriced stocks. However, defenders of the efficient market hypothesis argue that Buffett is an exception rather than the rule. They believe that while a few investors may outperform the market, the vast majority do not, and even those who succeed may have done so due to luck rather than skill. Studies have shown that most actively managed investment funds fail to consistently outperform simple index funds, which support the idea that stock prices already reflect all available information. A famous case study that highlights the debate between active investing and market efficiency is the comparison between Warren Buffett and index funds. Buffett himself has acknowledged that for most investors, trying to beat the market is a losing game. In 2007, he made a famous bet with a hedge fund manager that a low-cost index fund tracking the S&P 500 would outperform a collection of hedge funds over a 10-year period. The result of the bet was clear. The index fund gained significantly more than the hedge funds, proving that even highly paid fund managers struggle to beat the market. This supports the argument that most investors are better off investing in passive index funds rather than trying to pick individual stocks. Despite the strong evidence in favor of the efficient market hypothesis, critics argue that markets are not always perfectly efficient. There are times when stock prices appear to be driven by emotions rather than logic, such as during financial bubbles and crashes. For example, the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s saw internet companies rise to extremely high valuations, even though many of them had no profits or sustainable business models. Eventually, the bubble burst and stock prices collapsed. If markets were always efficient, such extreme mispricing would not happen. Another example is the 2008 financial crisis, where the prices of mortgage-backed securities did not accurately reflect the risks involved, leading to massive losses when the housing market collapsed. These events suggest that while markets are generally efficient, they can sometimes be influenced by irrational behavior. The efficient market hypothesis has had a major impact on investment strategies and financial regulations. It has encouraged the growth of index funds, which offer low-cost, diversified investment options for people who do not want to try and pick individual stocks. It has also influenced laws against insider trading and led to greater transparency in financial reporting. However, the theory is still debated, and many investors continue to believe that with the right strategy and information, it is possible to achieve higher returns. Whether markets are perfectly efficient or not, one thing is clear: investing is complex, and understanding how information affects stock prices is crucial for making smart financial decisions. Endogenous growth theory is an important economic idea that explains how long-term economic growth happens from within a country or an economy rather than from external factors. This theory was developed as an improvement to earlier growth models that mostly focused on external influences like capital investment and technological advancements coming from outside sources. The key argument of endogenous growth theory is that economic progress is largely driven by factors within the economy, such as investments in education, research, innovation, and knowledge creation. Unlike older growth models that suggested economies would eventually slow down as they reach a certain level of development, this theory argues that continuous investments in human capital, new technologies, and knowledge-based industries can lead to sustained and long-term growth. The more a country invests in ideas, skills, and innovation, the more productive its workers and businesses become, leading to higher levels of economic output and improved standards of living. One of the main ideas behind endogenous growth theory is the role of human capital, which refers to the knowledge, skills, and abilities of people in an economy. According to this theory, when countries invest in education and training, they create a highly skilled workforce that can develop new ideas, improve existing processes, and create innovative products and services. For example, when a country spends money on improving schools, universities, and research institutions, it helps people acquire valuable skills that allow them to be more productive. This increased productivity leads to higher wages, better jobs, and overall economic growth. Unlike physical capital such as machinery and factories, human capital does not face diminishing returns because knowledge can be shared and passed on to future generations. The more a society learns and innovates, the more it can continue to grow without slowing down. Another major factor in endogenous growth theory is the importance of research and development. The theory argues that innovation is a key driver of long-term economic progress because new technologies improve efficiency, reduce costs, and create entirely new industries. When businesses invest in research and development, they create new products and services that generate higher profits and attract more investment. For example, the development of the personal computer, the internet, and artificial intelligence has transformed entire industries and led to massive economic expansion. Unlike traditional growth theories that viewed technological progress as an external factor, endogenous growth theory emphasizes that economies can influence their own growth by investing in innovation and new ideas. Governments also play an important role by funding research programs, providing tax incentives for innovation, and ensuring that strong intellectual property protections encourage businesses to develop new technologies. One of the best real-world examples of endogenous growth theory in action is the rise of Silicon Valley and the tech boom. Silicon Valley, located in California, is home to some of the most successful technology companies in the world, including Apple, Google, Facebook, and Tesla. The rapid economic growth in this region is a direct result of continuous investments in human capital, research, and innovation. Many of the top technology firms in Silicon Valley were founded by highly skilled entrepreneurs who studied at world-class universities like Stanford and the University of California, Berkeley. These universities played a crucial role in advancing knowledge and producing highly educated individuals who contributed to the growth of the technology industry. Silicon Valley's success also highlights the importance of strong networks and collaboration in economic growth. Companies in the region have benefited from a culture of knowledge sharing, where entrepreneurs, investors, and researchers constantly exchange ideas and build on each other's innovations. This ecosystem of continuous learning and improvement has created an environment where businesses can thrive and generate new breakthroughs. The rise of venture capital in Silicon Valley further demonstrates how financial investment in new ideas can accelerate economic expansion. Investors provide funding to promising startups, allowing them to develop cutting-edge technologies that drive long-term growth. This cycle of investment, innovation, and knowledge sharing has allowed Silicon Valley to maintain its position as a global leader in technology and economic development. Endogenous growth theory also explains why countries with strong education systems and research institutions tend to experience higher rates of economic growth. Nations that prioritize science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education produce more skilled workers who can contribute to innovation and productivity. Countries like South Korea and Germany have successfully used this approach to transform their economies into global leaders in technology and manufacturing. South Korea, for example, heavily invested in education and research after the Korean War, which led to the rise of major technology companies such as Samsung and LG. Similarly, Germany's focus on engineering and technical training has helped it become a dominant force in the automobile and industrial manufacturing sectors. Critics of endogenous growth theory argue that it does not fully account for economic inequality and the differences in growth rates between countries. While some nations have successfully invested in human capital and innovation, others struggle due to poor governance, lack of infrastructure, and limited access to education. Additionally, not all investments in research and development lead to economic growth, as some technologies fail to produce significant improvements or become obsolete. However, despite these challenges, the theory remains a powerful explanation of how modern economies grow and why certain regions like Silicon Valley continue to thrive. Overall, endogenous growth theory provides a strong argument for why countries should focus on investing in education, innovation, and research to achieve long-term economic success. It highlights the importance of knowledge and human capital in driving productivity and creating new industries. Real-world examples like Silicon Valley, South Korea, and Germany show that continuous investments in people and ideas can lead to sustained economic expansion. As technology continues to evolve, economies that embrace innovation and learning will likely be the ones that experience the highest levels of growth and prosperity. The Phillips Curve is an important economic concept that describes the relationship between inflation and unemployment. It was first introduced by economist A.W. Phillips in 1958 when he studied wage data in the United Kingdom and noticed a pattern. He found that when unemployment was low, wages tended to rise more quickly, which suggested that inflation would also increase. On the other hand, when unemployment was high, wages rose more slowly or even declined, leading to lower inflation. This observation led to the idea that there is an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment, meaning that when one goes up, the other goes down. Policymakers and economists initially believed that this relationship was stable and could be used to make decisions about economic policy. Governments thought they could choose between lower inflation with higher unemployment or higher inflation with lower unemployment based on their economic goals. The logic behind the Phillips curve is relatively simple. When unemployment is low, there are fewer workers available for businesses to hire, which means companies have to compete for workers by offering higher wages. As wages increase, workers have more money to spend, which boosts demand for goods and services. This increased demand allows businesses to raise their prices, leading to inflation. On the other hand, when unemployment is high, there are many workers available, so businesses do not have to offer higher wages to attract employees. With stagnant or lower wages, workers have less money to spend, reducing overall demand in the economy. This lower demand leads businesses to keep prices stable or even lower them, which results in lower inflation or even deflation. For many years, the Phillips curve was seen as a useful tool for policymakers. Governments believed they could use fiscal and monetary policies to fine-tune the economy by adjusting inflation and unemployment levels. For example, if unemployment was too high, they could increase government spending or lower interest rates to stimulate demand and reduce unemployment, even if it meant accepting higher inflation. Conversely, if inflation was rising too fast, they could cut government spending or raise interest rates to slow down the economy, even if it led to higher unemployment. This approach influenced economic policies in many countries during the 1960s. However, the stability of the Phillips curve was challenged in the 1970s when a major economic event called stagflation occurred. Stagflation is a situation where inflation remains high, even as unemployment also rises, which contradicts the expected trade-off described by the Phillips Curve. This period of stagflation was caused by several factors, including oil price shocks, changes in global economic conditions, and shifts in government policies. In the early 1970s, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, imposed oil embargoes, causing oil prices to skyrocket. Since oil is a critical resource for transportation, manufacturing, and energy production, the sharp increase in oil prices led to higher costs for businesses and consumers. As a result, businesses raised prices on goods and services, contributing to inflation. At the same time, the economy slowed down due to the rising costs, leading to higher unemployment. This situation directly challenged the idea that inflation and unemployment always move in opposite directions. The experience of the 1970s forced economists to reconsider the validity of the Phillips Curve. Some economists, including Milton Friedman and Edmund Phelps, argued that the relationship between inflation and unemployment was not as simple as originally thought. They introduced the concept of the natural rate of unemployment, which suggests that there is a level of unemployment that the economy naturally gravitates toward, regardless of inflation. They also proposed the idea of inflation expectations, which means that people's expectations about future inflation play a crucial role in determining actual inflation levels. If workers and businesses expect inflation to rise, they will demand higher wages and set higher prices, which can create a self-fulfilling cycle of inflation. One of the key lessons from the breakdown of the Phillips Curve in the 1970s is that inflation is not solely determined by unemployment, but also by other factors such as supply shocks, monetary policy, and expectations. Central banks, particularly the US Federal Reserve, learned that controlling inflation required more than just managing unemployment. In response to stagflation, the Federal Reserve, under Chairman Paul Volcker in the early 1980s, took aggressive action by sharply raising interest rates to control inflation. This move caused a deep recession and temporarily increased unemployment, but it successfully brought inflation under control and restored confidence in the economy. Today, economists recognize that the relationship between inflation and unemployment is more complex than the original Phillips curve suggested. While there may still be a short-term trade-off between inflation and unemployment, it is not a permanent or predictable relationship. Many factors, including global economic conditions, productivity growth, technology, and central bank policies, influence inflation and unemployment. For example, in the 1990s and early 2000s, some economies experienced both low unemployment and low inflation at the same time, which further challenged the traditional Phillips curve model. In modern economics, the Phillips curve is often used as a reference rather than a strict rule. Policymakers understand that inflation and unemployment are influenced by multiple forces, and they use a combination of monetary policy, fiscal policy, and supply-side measures to manage economic stability. The lessons from the 1970s stagflation era continue to shape economic decision-making today. Central banks closely monitor inflation expectations and take proactive steps to prevent inflation from spiraling out of control, while also aiming to keep unemployment at a reasonable level. Overall, the Phillips curve remains an important concept in economic theory, but it is no longer viewed as an absolute rule. The events of the 1970s demonstrated that inflation and unemployment do not always move in opposite directions, and other factors such as supply shocks and expectations play a crucial role in shaping economic outcomes. Understanding these complexities has helped policymakers develop better strategies for managing inflation, unemployment, and economic growth in a constantly changing global economy. Public choice theory is an economic theory that applies the principles of economics to political decision-making. It challenges the traditional view that politicians and government officials always act in the best interest of the public. Instead, it suggests that politicians, bureaucrats, and voters act based on their own self-interest, just like businesses and consumers in a market. This theory was developed by economists such as James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock in the mid-20th century, and it provides a new way of understanding government behavior. Public choice theory argues that government officials, like any other individuals, respond to incentives, which means they make decisions that benefit themselves rather than always prioritizing the common good. This perspective explains why governments sometimes make inefficient or costly policy decisions that do not necessarily serve the public interest. One of the key ideas in public choice theory is that politicians seek to maximize their chances of getting re-elected. To do this, they often make promises that appeal to specific groups of voters or campaign donors rather than making decisions that benefit the economy as a whole. For example, politicians may support policies that provide short-term benefits, such as tax cuts or increased government spending, even if these policies lead to long-term financial problems like rising national debt. They may also favor policies that benefit well-organized interest groups, because these groups provide campaign donations and political support. This process, known as rent-seeking, occurs when businesses, unions, or other special interest groups try to influence government policies in ways that give them financial advantages, such as subsidies, tax breaks, or regulatory protections, rather than competing fairly in the market. Another important aspect of public choice theory is the role of bureaucrats in government decision-making. Bureaucrats are government employees who implement policies and manage public programs. According to public choice theory, bureaucrats are also motivated by self-interest, which can lead to inefficiency and waste in government spending. For example, a government agency may seek a larger budget or more staff not because it is necessary to improve public services, but because it benefits the agency's leadership by increasing their power and influence. This creates what is known as bureaucratic expansion, where government agencies grow over time even if they do not become more effective. Bureaucrats may also resist reforms that would make government operations more efficient because those changes could reduce their budgets or job security. One real-world example of public choice theory in action is the issue of government bailouts and lobbying. In times of economic crisis, governments sometimes step in to rescue failing businesses, particularly large corporations or financial institutions. While these bailouts are often justified as necessary to prevent economic collapse, they can also be influenced by political and corporate interests. For example, during the 2008 financial crisis, the US government provided massive bailouts to banks and financial firms that were deemed too big to fail. Public choice theory suggests that these bailouts were not only driven by economic concerns, but also by the influence of powerful banking executives and lobbyists who had strong political connections. Many of these companies had spent millions of dollars on lobbying efforts to secure favorable treatment from the government. This raises concerns about moral hazard, where businesses take excessive risks, knowing that the government will rescue them if they fail, leading to an unfair system where taxpayers bear the costs of corporate failures. Lobbying is another example of how public choice theory explains political decision-making. Lobbying occurs when businesses, unions, or other interest groups try to influence government policies in their favor. Large corporations and industry groups spend billions of dollars each year on lobbying efforts to shape laws and regulations that benefit them. For example, pharmaceutical companies lobby for patent protections that prevent generic drug competition. Oil companies lobby for tax breaks on energy production, and technology firms lobby against stricter data privacy regulations. While lobbying is a legal and common practice, it often leads to policies that benefit a small group of powerful players at the expense of ordinary citizens. Public choice theory suggests that politicians are more likely to listen to these well-funded interest groups because they provide financial support for election campaigns, making the political system less responsive to the needs of the general public. Public choice theory also provides insight into why government programs often continue even when they are no longer effective. In a market economy, businesses that fail to provide valuable products or services eventually go out of business. However, government programs do not operate under the same competitive pressures. Even if a government program is wasteful or outdated, there is often little incentive for politicians or bureaucrats to eliminate it, because doing so could result in lost jobs, reduced funding, or political backlash. This concept, known as government failure, occurs when government intervention leads to inefficient outcomes that would not happen in a free market. Public choice theory suggests that many government programs persist, not because they are effective, but because they benefit specific interest groups or government officials who have a stake in keeping them alive. Despite its criticisms of government inefficiency and political self-interest, public choice theory does not argue that all government action is bad or unnecessary. Instead, it highlights the importance of designing policies that minimize corruption, waste, and special interest influence. One potential solution is to limit the power of government in certain areas so that politicians and bureaucrats have fewer opportunities to engage in rent-seeking behavior. Another approach is to increase transparency and accountability in government decision-making, such as requiring full disclosure of lobbying activities and campaign contributions. Some economists also advocate for market-based solutions, such as privatization and competition in public services, to reduce inefficiency and encourage better performance. Overall, public choice theory provides a valuable perspective on how economic principles apply to political decision-making. It challenges the assumption that government officials always act in the public's best interest, and instead suggests that they respond to incentives like any other individuals. By understanding how self-interest, lobbying, and rent-seeking influence government policies, we can develop better strategies for improving governance and reducing inefficiency. The real-world examples of government bailouts and lobbying demonstrate how political decisions are often shaped by the interests of powerful groups rather than the needs of ordinary citizens. While governments play an essential role in the economy, public choice theory reminds us that their actions are not always guided by pure intentions, and careful oversight is needed to ensure that policies serve the broader public interest rather than benefiting a select few. Modern portfolio theory is a financial theory that explains how investors can reduce risk by diversifying their investments across different types of assets. It was developed by economist Harry Markowitz in the 1950s and remains one of the most important ideas in investment management. The main idea behind modern portfolio theory is that investors should not put all their money into one stock or one type of asset because this increases their exposure to risk. Instead, by spreading investments across a variety of assets such as stocks, bonds, and real estate, investors can reduce the impact of any single investment performing poorly. This strategy is known as diversification, and it helps investors balance risk and return in their portfolios. The key concept in modern portfolio theory is that different types of investments do not always move in the same direction. For example, when the stock market is performing well, bond prices may fall because investors prefer to invest in stocks. On the other hand, when the stock market declines, bond prices often rise because investors see them as a safer option. By investing in both stocks and bonds, investors can reduce the overall risk in their portfolio because gains in one asset class can offset losses in another. This is known as negative correlation, and it plays a major role in how diversification works. If an investor only holds one type of investment, they are exposed to higher risk because the performance of their entire portfolio depends on the success or failure of that single asset. Another important idea in modern portfolio theory is the concept of the efficient frontier. The efficient frontier is a graph that shows the best possible portfolios that offer the highest return for a given level of risk. According to the theory, investors should aim to build a portfolio that lies on the efficient frontier because it maximizes returns while keeping risk at an acceptable level. If a portfolio is below the efficient frontier, it means the investor is not getting the best possible return for the amount of risk they are taking. If a portfolio is above the efficient frontier, it is not possible because it would require unrealistically high returns without taking on additional risk. This concept helps investors make smarter decisions about how to allocate their investments. One of the most common real-world applications of modern portfolio theory is how pension funds and other institutional investors manage their money. Pension funds need to ensure they have enough money to pay retirees in the future, so they must carefully balance risk and return in their investment strategies. If they take too much risk, they could suffer heavy losses and fail to meet their financial obligations. If they take too little risk, their investments may not grow enough to keep up with inflation and future pension payments. To manage this challenge, pension funds typically invest in a mix of stocks, bonds, real estate, and other assets to create a diversified portfolio. This helps them reduce risk while still earning steady returns over time. For example, a pension fund may allocate a portion of its portfolio to stocks, which offer higher returns but come with more volatility. At the same time, it may invest in bonds, which provide more stability but lower returns. In addition, the fund may invest in alternative assets such as real estate, commodities, or private equity to further diversify its holdings. By following the principles of modern portfolio theory, pension funds can create portfolios that are better protected against market fluctuations and economic downturns. This approach allows them to provide financial security for retirees while managing investment risks effectively. Another example of how modern portfolio theory is used in practice is the rise of index funds and exchange-traded funds. These investment products allow investors to easily diversify their portfolios by holding a broad mix of stocks and bonds without having to pick individual investments. Index funds track the performance of a specific market index, such as the S&P 500, which represents the largest companies in the US stock market. Because these funds include many different stocks, they help investors achieve diversification without the need for active management. Exchange-traded funds, or ETFs, work in a similar way, but offer even greater flexibility because they can be bought and sold like individual stocks. Both index funds and ETFs have become popular investment choices because they allow investors to follow the principles of modern portfolio theory with minimal effort and low costs. Despite its benefits, modern portfolio theory has some limitations. One criticism is that it relies on historical data to predict future investment returns and risks. However, financial markets are constantly changing, and past performance does not always guarantee future results. Another limitation is that the theory assumes investors are always rational and make decisions based on logic and mathematical calculations. In reality, emotions and psychological biases often influence investment choices, leading people to make irrational decisions such as panic selling during market downturns or chasing high returns without considering risk. Additionally, modern portfolio theory assumes that correlations between different assets remain stable over time, but during major financial crises, many assets that normally move in opposite directions can suddenly decline at the same time, reducing the effectiveness of diversification. Despite these challenges, modern portfolio theory remains one of the most widely used frameworks in investment management. It provides a clear and logical approach to reducing risk and maximizing returns through diversification. Financial advisors, investment managers, and institutional investors all rely on the principles of modern portfolio theory when constructing investment portfolios. By understanding how different assets interact and how to allocate investments wisely, individuals and organizations can build portfolios that provide long-term financial stability and growth. The real-world example of pension funds demonstrates how diversification helps manage investment risks, ensuring that retirees receive their benefits even in uncertain economic conditions. Modern portfolio theory has shaped the way people invest for decades, and its principles continue to guide financial decision-making in today's markets. Prospect theory is a psychological and economic theory that explains how people make decisions when faced with uncertainty, especially when dealing with gains and losses. Developed by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in the 1970s, this theory challenges the traditional idea that people always make rational decisions based on logic and expected outcomes. Instead, prospect theory shows that people often make choices based on how they perceive gains and losses rather than the actual final result. The key insight of the theory is that people fear losses much more than they value gains. This means that losing a certain amount of money feels more painful than the happiness they experience from gaining the same amount. For example, if someone loses $100, they will feel more upset than they would feel happy if they gained $100. This difference in emotional intensity affects how people behave in financial and investment decisions. One of the main ideas behind prospect theory is called loss aversion. Loss aversion means that people tend to avoid losses even if it means missing out on potential gains. This explains why many investors hesitate to sell a stock that is losing value, because they do not want to accept the loss, even if selling it and reinvesting in a better opportunity would be a smarter choice. Similarly, people may hold on to losing investments for too long in the hope that the price will recover rather than cutting their losses and moving on. This behavior can be seen during stock market crashes when many investors panic and sell their investments at a loss instead of waiting for the market to stabilize. The fear of losing more money often pushes people to make emotional decisions rather than logical ones. Another important part of prospect theory is that people view gains and losses differently depending on their starting point. This is known as reference dependence. Instead of looking at the overall value of their wealth, people judge changes in their financial situation based on their personal reference point. For example, if an investor expects to make a 20% return on their stock portfolio but only earns 10%, they might feel disappointed, even though they still made a profit. On the other hand, if they were expecting to lose money, but instead broke even, they might feel relieved. This shows that people's decisions are influenced by expectations and comparisons rather than absolute numbers. It also explains why people take more risks to avoid losses than they do to achieve gains. If someone is already losing money, they may take bigger risks to try to recover their losses, even if those risks could lead to even bigger losses. Prospect theory also explains a common mistake in investing known as the disposition effect. The disposition effect occurs when investors sell their winning stocks too quickly to lock in profits while holding on to losing stocks for too long because they do not want to admit defeat. This behavior goes against traditional economic theory, which says that investors should sell underperforming assets and keep assets that are growing in value. However, because of loss aversion, people find it psychologically difficult to accept a loss, even when selling a losing investment would be the better financial decision. This effect can lead to lower overall returns for investors because they end up keeping bad investments while selling good ones too soon. A real-world example of prospect theory in action is the stock market crash of 2008. During the global financial crisis, stock prices fell rapidly, causing widespread fear among investors. Instead of staying calm and holding onto their investments, many investors panicked and sold their stocks at a loss, fearing that prices would continue to drop. This selling pressure caused stock prices to fall even further, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of panic and decline. The fear of losing more money was so strong that many investors ignored logical advice to stay invested for the long term. Those who sold their stocks during the crash often missed out on the market recovery that followed in the years after. This pattern of panic selling is a classic example of how loss aversion influences financial decision-making. Another case study that illustrates prospect theory is how people behave in casinos and gambling situations. When people are winning, they tend to take fewer risks because they want to lock in their gains and avoid losing their winnings. However, when they are losing, they often take bigger risks to try to recover their losses. This is why gamblers who are down tend to bet larger amounts, hoping to break even, while those who are up may stop playing to secure their profits. This behavior shows how people react differently to gains and losses based on their personal reference points. It also explains why many people continue gambling even when they are losing money, as they focus more on avoiding losses than making rational financial decisions. Prospect theory has had a major impact on the field of behavioral economics, which studies how psychological factors influence economic decisions. Traditional economic theories assume that people always act rationally, but prospect theory shows that emotions and biases play a significant role in decision-making. This has led to new approaches in fields such as finance, marketing, and public policy. For example, governments and businesses use insights from prospect theory to design better policies and incentives. Financial advisors use it to help clients make better investment decisions by understanding their fears and biases. Marketers apply it when setting prices or offering discounts, knowing that customers are more likely to take action if a deal is framed as avoiding a loss rather than gaining a benefit. Despite its many insights, prospect theory has some limitations. One criticism is that it focuses mainly on short-term decision-making rather than long-term financial planning. While it explains why people panic during market downturns, it does not fully address how people learn from experience and adjust their behavior over time. Additionally, it does not always predict behavior in every situation, as some people may be more risk-tolerant than others. However, despite these limitations, prospect theory remains one of the most influential ideas in behavioral economics and has helped change the way economists and policymakers understand human decision-making. Overall, prospect theory provides a clear explanation of why people make irrational financial decisions, especially when dealing with uncertainty, risk, and losses. It shows that people fear losses more than they value gains, and that this fear can lead to poor decision-making in investing, gambling, and everyday financial choices. The real-world examples of stock market crashes, gambling behavior, and investment mistakes highlight how loss aversion affects financial markets and individual investors. By understanding these psychological biases, investors and policymakers can make better financial decisions and develop strategies to avoid the common traps that lead to poor outcomes. Network economics is the study of how the value of a product or service changes as more people use it. This idea is based on network effects, which means that as more people join or use a platform, the overall value of the platform increases for everyone. This concept is especially important in digital markets where businesses like social media platforms, ride-sharing services, and online marketplaces rely on having a large number of users to succeed. Unlike traditional businesses that focus on producing and selling physical goods, network-based businesses grow in value simply by attracting more users. The more people who use a product or service, the more useful and valuable it becomes. This creates a situation where successful platforms can quickly dominate an industry by gaining an early advantage and attracting more users than their competitors. There are two main types of network effects: direct and indirect. Direct network effects happen when the value of a product increases simply because more people use it. A good example is social media. If only a few people are on a platform like Facebook, then it is not very useful because there are not many people to connect with. However, as more users join, the platform becomes more valuable because people can interact with a larger network of friends, family, and businesses. Indirect network effects happen when the value of a product or service increases due to the presence of complementary goods or services. A great example is Uber. The more riders who use Uber, the more valuable the platform becomes for drivers because they have more opportunities to earn money. At the same time, the more drivers that join, the more valuable the platform becomes for riders because they can get faster and cheaper rides. This cycle of increasing value makes it difficult for new competitors to enter the market because the leading platform has already established a large and valuable network. Network effects can create powerful advantages for companies that manage to build large user bases early on. Once a company reaches a certain level of users, it becomes harder for competitors to attract customers away from them. This is why many digital businesses grow very quickly and then become dominant players in their industries. Companies like Facebook, Google, and Amazon have all used network effects to strengthen their market positions. For example, Facebook became the world's largest social media platform because the more people who joined, the harder it became for users to switch to another platform. If all of a person's friends, family, and favorite businesses are on Facebook, then switching to a new social media platform would mean losing those connections. This creates what is known as a lock-in effect, where users feel stuck with a platform because moving to another one would mean starting over. This is one reason why newer social media platforms struggle to compete with Facebook, even if they offer better features. One of the biggest challenges in network economics is the problem of winner-takes-all markets. In traditional markets, companies compete by offering better products, lower prices, or better customer service. However, in digital markets, the company that builds the largest network first often becomes the dominant player, making it nearly impossible for competitors to succeed. This has led to the rise of digital monopolies, where a single company controls most of a market. A classic example is Uber in the ride-sharing industry. When Uber first launched, it aggressively expanded to new cities and offered incentives to both drivers and riders to attract as many users as possible. Once it built a large network of drivers and riders, it became very difficult for new competitors to enter the market because they could not offer the same level of service. Riders preferred Uber because there were more drivers available, leading to shorter wait times, and drivers preferred Uber because there were more customers looking for rides. This created a self-reinforcing cycle where Uber continued to grow while smaller competitors struggled to gain traction. The same pattern can be seen in the case of Facebook. In the early days of social media, many different platforms competed for users, including MySpace, Friendster, and Orkut. However, Facebook grew rapidly because it focused on building strong network effects. By encouraging users to invite their friends, and by providing a better user experience, Facebook was able to attract millions of users. As more people joined, it became the default social network for staying connected. Over time, Facebook's dominance made it almost impossible for other platforms to compete. Even when new social media apps like Instagram and WhatsApp became popular, Facebook acquired them to maintain its dominance. This shows how network effects can lead to industry concentration, where a few large companies control most of the market. One of the main concerns with network economics is that it can lead to monopolies that reduce competition and harm consumers. When a company becomes too dominant, it can raise prices, reduce innovation, or limit choices for consumers. Governments and regulators around the world have started to take action against big technology companies that have used network effects to establish monopolies. For example, Facebook has faced legal challenges for its control over social media, and Uber has been criticized for driving smaller competitors out of business. In some cases, governments have tried to break up monopolies or introduce new regulations to promote competition. However, regulating digital markets is difficult because network effects naturally favor large platforms, and consumers often prefer to use the biggest and most popular services. Another challenge of network economics is that while network effects help companies grow, they can also work in reverse. Just as a platform becomes more valuable when more people use it, it can also lose value if users start to leave. This is known as a negative network effect. If too many users leave a platform, the remaining users may also leave because they see less value in staying. A good example is MySpace, which was once the leading social media platform but lost users to Facebook. As more people switched to Facebook, MySpace became less valuable, leading even more users to leave. This shows that while network effects can help companies grow quickly, they can also lead to rapid declines if a platform fails to keep users engaged. Network economics also plays a big role in the sharing economy, where companies like Airbnb and Uber use digital platforms to connect buyers and sellers. In these industries, network effects create a strong competitive advantage. The more hosts that list properties on Airbnb, the more valuable the platform becomes for travelers looking for places to stay. At the same time, the more travelers that use Airbnb, the more valuable it becomes for hosts, because they can reach more potential guests. This makes it difficult for new competitors to enter the market because they need to build both the supply, hosts, and the demand, travelers, at the same time. This is why platforms like Airbnb and Uber have become dominant in their industries, while smaller competitors struggle to attract users. Overall, network economics is one of the most important concepts in understanding how digital markets work. It explains why some companies grow rapidly and become dominant while others struggle to compete. Businesses that successfully leverage network effects can create powerful advantages that make them difficult to challenge. However, these advantages can also lead to monopolies and reduce competition, which raises concerns for regulators and policymakers. The case studies of Facebook, Uber, and Airbnb show how network effects shape the modern economy and influence the success or failure of digital platforms. As technology continues to evolve, network economics will play an even bigger role in shaping industries, business models, and market competition. The theory of economic bubbles is the study of how asset prices rise far above their actual value due to speculation and then suddenly collapse, causing financial crises and economic damage. A bubble happens when people buy assets like stocks, real estate, or even cryptocurrencies, not because they are actually worth that price, but because they believe they can sell them later for even more. This creates a cycle where prices keep going up simply because more and more people are willing to buy. However, at some point, reality sets in, and people realize that the asset is not worth its inflated price. When this happens, panic spreads, investors rush to sell, and prices crash, often leading to financial losses, bankruptcies, and even wider economic recessions. Economic bubbles have been studied for centuries because they show how markets can sometimes behave irrationally, despite the belief that prices should be determined by logic and fundamentals. Economic bubbles typically follow a predictable pattern. First, there is an initial phase where a new technology, investment trend, or government policy creates excitement and optimism. Investors believe they have discovered something that will lead to big profits, so they start buying up assets, driving prices higher. This is followed by a boom phase where more and more people get involved, often including inexperienced investors who fear missing out on easy profits. As the bubble grows, prices become disconnected from reality because people are no longer investing based on actual value, but rather on the belief that prices will keep rising. At the peak of the bubble, warning signs start to appear. Some investors realize that the prices are too high and begin selling. However, many others continue to hold on, believing that the upward trend will continue. Then comes the bursting phase, where panic spreads as people rush to sell before prices drop further. This often happens suddenly, leading to a rapid and severe collapse in prices, leaving many investors with massive losses. Finally, in the aftermath, the economy goes through a period of adjustment as businesses fail, jobs are lost, and financial markets take time to recover. One of the most famous economic bubbles was the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s and early 2000s. This was caused by excitement over the rise of the internet and technology companies. Investors believed that the internet would change the economy forever, so they started pouring money into technology startups, even if those companies had no profits or clear business models. The stock prices of internet companies skyrocketed as everyone wanted to invest in the next big thing. Many companies that had little or no revenue were able to raise millions of dollars simply by adding .com to their name. Traditional rules of investing were ignored because people believed that the internet had created a new economy where profits no longer mattered. However, by early 2000, reality set in. Many of these companies failed to deliver profits, and investors started to lose confidence. As panic spread, stock prices collapsed, wiping out trillions of dollars in wealth. Many technology companies went bankrupt, and thousands of employees lost their jobs. The bursting of the dot-com bubble led to an economic slowdown and a stock market downturn that lasted for several years. Another major example is the 2008 housing bubble, which had even more devastating consequences. This bubble was fueled by a combination of low interest rates, risky lending practices, and the belief that home prices would never fall. Banks and financial institutions gave out loans to homebuyers who could not afford them, often with little or no requirements for proof of income. These risky loans were then bundled together and sold as investments, creating a massive market for mortgage-backed securities. As more and more people took out loans to buy houses, home prices soared to unsustainable levels. Many people bought houses as investments, expecting prices to keep rising. However, by 2007, cracks began to appear. Home prices stopped rising, and borrowers who could not afford their mortgage payments began defaulting. This caused panic in the financial system as banks and investors holding mortgage-backed securities suffered huge losses. The crisis worsened in 2008 when major financial institutions like Lehman Brothers collapsed, triggering a global financial meltdown. Stock markets crashed, millions of people lost their homes and jobs, and governments had to step in with massive bailouts to prevent a complete economic collapse. The effects of the 2008 financial crisis were felt for years, leading to economic stagnation and new regulations aimed at preventing future bubbles. Economic bubbles have occurred throughout history, And they continue to happen because human psychology plays a major role in financial markets. People are often driven by greed and fear, leading them to make irrational investment decisions. When prices are rising, investors feel confident and do not want to miss out, so they keep buying even when the asset is overpriced. However, when prices start to fall, the same investors panic and rush to sell, causing an even faster collapse. This herd mentality is what makes bubbles so dangerous. Even experienced investors can get caught up in the excitement of a booming market, only to suffer huge losses when the bubble bursts. Governments and financial regulators try to prevent bubbles by monitoring financial markets and controlling risky behavior, but it is difficult to stop speculation when investors believe they are making easy money. The study of economic bubbles is important because it helps us understand why financial crises happen and how they can be prevented. Economists have developed different theories to explain bubbles, including the greater fool theory, which suggests that investors buy overpriced assets because they believe someone else will buy them at an even higher price. There is also the theory of irrational exuberance, which describes how investors become overly optimistic and ignore risks. Some economists argue that bubbles are an unavoidable part of capitalism because markets will always go through cycles of boom and bust. Others believe that better regulations and financial education can help prevent the worst effects of bubbles. However, history shows that economic bubbles will continue to occur because human nature does not change. Investors are always looking for the next big opportunity, and as long as there is money to be made, speculation will drive prices beyond their true value. In the modern era, new types of economic bubbles have emerged, including the cryptocurrency bubble and the rise of speculative assets like meme stocks and non-fungible tokens. The cryptocurrency market has experienced multiple boom and bust cycles, with prices of digital currencies like Bitcoin and Ethereum soaring to record highs before crashing dramatically. Many investors jumped into the crypto market hoping to get rich quickly, but the extreme volatility led to massive losses when prices collapsed. Similarly, the rise of meme stocks, such as GameStop in 2021, showed how online communities and social media can fuel speculative bubbles. Investors coordinated their buying behavior, driving up stock prices far beyond their actual value before the inevitable crash left many with losses. The theory of economic bubbles is a critical part of financial economics because it explains how markets can become disconnected from reality and why financial crises happen. The case studies of the dot-com bubble and the 2008 housing bubble show how speculation, risky investments, and mass psychology can create unsustainable booms followed by devastating crashes. Understanding economic bubbles can help investors make better decisions and help policymakers create regulations that reduce financial instability. However, no matter how much we learn from past bubbles, history suggests that new bubbles will continue to form as long as speculation and human emotions drive financial markets. Chaos theory in economics is the study of how small changes in the economy can lead to unpredictable and sometimes extreme outcomes. This idea comes from mathematics and physics, where chaos theory explains how tiny differences in starting conditions can create huge variations over time. In economics, this means that a small event, like a slight increase in oil prices or a factory shutting down, can trigger a chain reaction that leads to major economic disruptions. Unlike traditional economic models that assume markets are stable and predictable, chaos theory suggests that economies are highly sensitive systems, where even minor shifts can create unexpected booms or crises. This is because economies are made up of millions of individuals, businesses, and governments, making decisions based on limited information, emotions, and external shocks. Since all these factors interact in complex ways, predicting the economy with absolute certainty becomes nearly impossible. One key idea in chaos theory is the butterfly effect, which suggests that a small change in one part of the system can have massive consequences elsewhere. For example, if a company decides to cut production of a popular product because of a temporary drop in demand, it could unknowingly cause shortages in the future, driving prices up and triggering inflation. Similarly, if investors panic and sell stocks based on a rumor, it could cause a market crash even if the rumor turns out to be false. This interconnectedness makes economies behave more like dynamic and unstable systems rather than perfectly balanced ones. Economists who study chaos theory argue that traditional models, which rely on simple cause and effect relationships, fail to capture the true complexity of how economies function. Another important concept in chaos theory is feedback loops, where an initial event sets off a chain reaction that amplifies its effects. Positive feedback loops make a trend stronger, while negative feedback loops slow it down. For example, in a financial crisis, panic selling can create a positive feedback loop, where falling stock prices cause more investors to sell, making the situation worse. On the other hand, during an economic recovery, rising consumer spending can encourage businesses to invest more, creating jobs and further boosting demand. These loops make it difficult to predict how economies will respond to shocks, because the effects of any event depend on how different parts of the economy react and interact. One of the best real-world examples of chaos theory in economics is the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on global supply chains. Before the pandemic, businesses and governments assumed that global supply chains were stable and efficient. Companies followed a just-in-time production model, where they kept only small inventories to reduce costs, assuming that supplies would always be available when needed. However, when COVID-19 hit, small disruptions quickly spiraled into major economic problems. Factory shutdowns in China, which at first seemed like a temporary issue, led to global shortages of essential products like medical supplies, electronics, and car parts. Since many industries depend on suppliers from different parts of the world, these disruptions caused ripple effects across economies. A delay in one country's production affected manufacturers in another country, leading to longer waiting times, higher costs, and supply chain bottlenecks that lasted for years. The shipping industry also experienced chaos due to small disruptions that turned into massive problems. When ports closed or operated at reduced capacity, thousands of shipping containers were stuck in the wrong locations, causing delays that affected businesses and consumers worldwide. The blockage of the Suez Canal in 2021, when a single cargo ship got stuck, demonstrated how one unexpected event could create a global economic crisis. The disruption affected billions of dollars in trade, delayed deliveries of goods, and forced companies to find alternative routes, increasing costs for businesses and consumers. This showed how a seemingly minor issue, like a single ship being stuck for a few days, could have widespread consequences for the entire global economy. Labor shortages also played a role in supply chain chaos. When workers in key industries like transportation and manufacturing got sick or had to quarantine, production and shipping slowed down. This shortage of workers meant that businesses could not operate at full capacity, leading to shortages of everyday goods. For example, the shortage of semiconductor chips affected everything from cars to gaming consoles, driving up prices and causing long wait times for consumers. Inflation, which was already rising due to supply chain disruptions, became worse as businesses passed higher costs onto customers. Governments tried to intervene by increasing spending and providing stimulus checks, but these actions had their own unintended consequences, such as increasing demand at a time when supply was already constrained. Another aspect of chaos theory in economics is how unexpected events can reveal hidden weaknesses in the system. The pandemic exposed how dependent modern economies are on global trade, and how fragile supply chains can be. Many companies and governments realized that relying too much on a few key suppliers or countries made them vulnerable to disruptions. As a result, businesses started looking for ways to make supply chains more resilient, such as bringing production closer to home or diversifying their suppliers. However, these changes take time, and the economic effects of the pandemic continue to be felt years later. Some industries, like travel and hospitality, took longer to recover, while others, like e-commerce and remote work technology, experienced a boom that reshaped consumer behavior. Chaos theory also helps explain why traditional economic predictions often fail during times of crisis. Economists rely on models that assume people and businesses will behave rationally and follow predictable patterns. However, during chaotic events like financial crashes or pandemics, emotions such as fear and uncertainty play a bigger role in decision-making. Investors panic, consumers change their spending habits, and businesses make sudden adjustments, all of which make the economy behave unpredictably. This is why economic forecasts can sometimes be completely wrong, as they do not account for the randomness and complexity of real-world events. The study of chaos theory in economics is important because it helps policymakers, businesses, and investors understand that economies are not always stable and predictable. Instead of assuming that markets will always correct themselves smoothly, chaos theory suggests that small shocks can create major disruptions, making it necessary to prepare for uncertainty. Governments can use this knowledge to design policies that make economies more resilient to shocks, such as investing in emergency stockpiles of essential goods, creating financial safety nets, or encouraging companies to build more flexible supply chains. Businesses can also use chaos theory to improve risk management, ensuring that they have backup plans in case of unexpected disruptions. In conclusion, chaos theory in economics challenges the idea that economies operate in a predictable and stable manner. Instead, it shows how small changes can create major economic consequences through interconnected systems, feedback loops, and unpredictable chain reactions. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a clear example of how small disruptions in supply chains led to global economic challenges, from product shortages to inflation. The lesson from chaos theory is that economies are dynamic and sensitive systems, and even the best economic models cannot always predict how events will unfold. By understanding chaos theory, businesses and policymakers can better prepare for uncertainty and reduce the impact of future economic shocks. Universal Basic Income, or UBI, is the idea that every citizen in a country should receive a guaranteed amount of money regularly, no matter what. The goal is to make sure that everyone has enough money to meet their basic needs like food, housing, and healthcare, regardless of whether they have a job or not. Supporters of UBI argue that it can help reduce poverty, give people more freedom to choose jobs they enjoy, and provide security in times of economic uncertainty. They believe that as technology improves and more jobs are replaced by automation, UBI could help people survive without depending on traditional employment. Critics, however, worry that giving people money without requiring them to work could make them less motivated to find jobs, increase government spending, and lead to higher taxes. They also argue that UBI might not be the best way to reduce poverty compared to other social programs like food assistance or free education. The debate over UBI has been going on for decades, and different countries have tested it to see how it works in practice. One of the most well-known real-world experiments with UBI happened in Finland between 2017 and 2018. The Finnish government wanted to see whether giving people a guaranteed monthly payment would help them find jobs, improve their well-being, and reduce bureaucracy in the welfare system. The experiment selected 2,000 unemployed people at random and gave each of them a fixed monthly payment of €560, which they would receive even if they found a job. This was different from traditional unemployment benefits, which usually stop or decrease when a person starts working. The goal was to see if removing the fear of losing benefits would encourage people to take jobs that they might otherwise avoid. The results of Finland's UBI experiment were both interesting and surprising. On one hand, it did not significantly increase employment among the participants. Many people who received the basic income did not find more work compared to those who remained in the regular unemployment system. This led some critics to argue that UBI does not encourage people to seek jobs as much as expected. However, the experiment did have positive effects on mental health and overall well-being. Participants reported feeling less stressed, happier, and more optimistic about the future. Since they knew they would receive a guaranteed amount of money every month, they worried less about financial insecurity. Some people even used the money to start small businesses or pursue education and training that could help them in the long run. This suggested that while UBI might not immediately increase employment, it could have other benefits that improve people's quality of life. Finland's experiment was not the first attempt to test UBI. Other experiments have taken place in different parts of the world, with varying results. For example, in Canada in the 1970s, the town of Dauphin in Manitoba tried a similar program called Mincome, where families were given a guaranteed income. The results showed that most people continued working, but some took more time to care for their children, complete their education, or look after elderly family members. More recently, in 2020, Spain introduced a form of basic income to help low-income families during the COVID-19 pandemic. In the United States, some cities like Stockton, California, have also experimented with basic income by giving small groups of people monthly payments and studying the effects. One of the biggest questions about UBI is how to fund it. Since giving every citizen a guaranteed income would require a huge amount of money, governments would need to raise taxes, cut spending in other areas, or find new sources of revenue. Some economists argue that a tax on big technology companies, which benefit the most from automation, could help fund UBI. Others suggest that UBI could replace some existing welfare programs, making the system simpler and more efficient. However, critics worry that high taxes or government debt could harm the economy and outweigh the benefits of basic income. Another major concern is whether UBI could lead to inflation. If everyone received a fixed amount of money every month, consumer spending would increase, which could drive up prices for goods and services. If businesses raise prices because people have more money to spend, the extra income from UBI might lose its value, making it less effective in reducing poverty. Supporters of UBI argue that this can be controlled by adjusting the amount given to people and ensuring that the economy remains stable. The debate over UBI has gained more attention in recent years, especially as automation and artificial intelligence continue to replace jobs. Some experts predict that millions of jobs could disappear in the coming decades as machines take over tasks that were once done by humans. If fewer jobs are available, UBI could become necessary to prevent mass unemployment and economic instability. However, others believe that new types of jobs will emerge, just as they have in past industrial revolutions, making UBI unnecessary. While Finland's UBI experiment provided valuable insights, it was limited in scope and duration. It only lasted for 2 years and focused on unemployed people rather than the entire population. To fully understand the effects of UBI, larger and longer-term studies are needed. Some countries, such as South Korea and Germany, are considering new experiments to see how UBI could work on a national scale. In the future, as societies continue to change and new challenges emerge, the idea of providing a basic income for all citizens will likely remain an important topic of discussion among economists, policymakers, and the public. Modern monetary theory, often called MMT, is a way of thinking about government spending, money, and debt that challenges traditional economic ideas. It argues that governments that control their own currency, like the United States, the United Kingdom, or Japan, do not have to worry about running out of money because they can always create more. This is very different from the way most people think about government budgets. Usually people compare government spending to a household budget. They believe that just like a family cannot spend more than it earns without going into debt, a government must also balance its budget by collecting enough taxes to pay for its expenses. However, MMT says that this is not how modern economies actually work. Instead, it suggests that governments do not need to worry about debt in the same way, because they can always print more money to pay for their spending. According to MMT, the real limit to government spending is not the size of its debt, but the risk of inflation. Inflation happens when there is too much money in the economy, causing prices to rise. If a government prints too much money without enough goods and services being produced, inflation can get out of control. However, MMT argues that as long as there is unused capacity in the economy, such as unemployed workers or factories that are not running at full capacity, the government can safely spend more money without causing inflation. This is because the extra money will be used to create jobs, increase production, and grow the economy, rather than just raising prices. Supporters of MMT believe that instead of worrying about balancing the budget, governments should focus on ensuring full employment and economic stability. They argue that if there are people who want to work but cannot find jobs, the government should spend more to create employment opportunities, even if it means increasing the national debt. Critics of MMT, however, warn that printing too much money can lead to serious economic problems. They argue that while a government may not go bankrupt in the traditional sense, excessive money creation can erode confidence in the currency, leading to hyperinflation. History has examples of countries where printing too much money led to economic disaster. For instance, in the 1920s, Germany printed massive amounts of money to pay off its war debts, causing hyperinflation where prices skyrocketed and money lost almost all its value. More recently, Venezuela experienced a similar problem when its government printed large amounts of money, leading to extreme inflation that made basic goods unaffordable for many people. Opponents of MMT fear that if governments follow this theory without careful planning, they could face similar situations. A major real-world example of MMT-style policies can be seen in the United States during the COVID-19 pandemic. In response to the economic crisis caused by the pandemic, the U.S. government and the Federal Reserve took unprecedented steps to support the economy. The Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the United States, printed trillions of dollars to buy government bonds, support financial markets, and provide loans to businesses. At the same time, the government passed massive stimulus packages that provided direct payments to citizens, expanded unemployment benefits, and helped businesses stay afloat. This level of government spending was historically large and was financed mainly by creating new money rather than raising taxes or borrowing in the traditional way. The impact of these policies was widely debated. On one hand, the stimulus measures helped prevent a complete economic collapse. Millions of people received financial assistance that allowed them to pay rent, buy food, and cover basic needs despite losing their jobs. Businesses that might have failed were able to survive, and the financial system remained stable. Many economists argue that without this aggressive government intervention, the economic downturn could have been much worse, leading to higher unemployment and a slower recovery. On the other hand, critics argue that the massive increase in money supply contributed to the high inflation that followed in the years after the pandemic. Prices for goods and services rose significantly, making life more expensive for many people. Some economists believe that the government and the Federal Reserve printed too much money too quickly, which overheated the economy and led to inflationary pressures. Another concern about MMT is how it affects government debt. Traditional economic thinking suggests that governments should be careful about borrowing too much money because it could lead to financial instability. However, MMT argues that as long as a country issues debt in its own currency, it does not need to worry about repaying it in the same way that individuals or businesses do. This is because the government can always create new money to pay off its debts. Supporters of MMT believe that this gives governments more flexibility to invest in public services, infrastructure, and social programs without fear of financial collapse. However, critics worry that if governments rely too much on money printing, it could reduce confidence in the economy, weaken the currency, and discourage investment. Despite the debates, elements of MMT have influenced economic policies in recent years. Many governments have increased spending during economic downturns, recognizing that they have more financial flexibility than previously thought. However, most mainstream economists still believe that there are limits to how much money can be printed without causing inflation and other economic problems. The key challenge is finding the right balance between using government spending to support the economy and avoiding excessive inflation or financial instability. Overall, modern monetary theory challenges traditional views on government finance and suggests that countries with their own currency have more control over their economy than commonly believed. While it provides a new way of thinking about government spending and debt, it also raises important questions about inflation, economic stability, and long-term financial sustainability. The experiences of countries like the United States during the COVID-19 crisis show both the potential benefits and risks of MMT-style policies. Whether governments fully embrace MMT or continue to follow more traditional economic approaches, the debate over how money and debt should be managed is likely to continue for many years to come.